The moment Evelyn Carter's boots hit the dirt of Samuel Mercer's front yard, she didn't look at the house. She looked at the ground, at the roses, at the carefully raked gravel paths lined with flowers that couldn't feed a single soul. She knelt down right there, travel dust still on her coat, the whole town watching, pressed her fingers into the soil and said quietly, "This is wrong. All of it." Samuel stood frozen on the porch. His jaw tightened. That was not the woman he had sent for. If you're new here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me all the way to the end, because what this woman does next is going to change everything you think you know about strength. The stagecoach had been 2 days late, which was the first insult Redstone Crossing had delivered to Evelyn Carter before she'd even set foot in it. She'd sat through a broken axle outside of Dalton Creek, a mud crossing that nearly swallowed the rear wheel whole in 12 hours, wedged between a traveling salesman who smelled of tobacco and a crate of iron hardware that shifted every time the road curved. She hadn't complained. She hadn't cried. She had instead watched the land change through the narrow window beside her head, the long, flat stretches of yellow grass giving way to red clay hills, the scrub oak thinning out the sky, going wide and enormous and pale as bleached linen. She had memorized a lot of things on that ride. The soil color, the way the creek beds ran, which direction the wagon ruts curved, and where they pooled in low ground after rain. She'd noted 2 separate farms set back from the road with abandoned fencing and overgrown fields, and she'd thought about why a man would walk away from working land, what it would take to bring that kind of ground back, what you'd plant first if you had a late start and not much time. That was the kind of woman Evelyn Carter was. She wasn't thinking about the wedding. She wasn't thinking about the dress folded at the bottom of her travel trunk, or whether Samuel Mercer would find her acceptable. She was thinking about the land because the land didn't care what she looked like, and the land would tell her everything she needed to know about whether this arrangement had any chance of surviving. The stagecoach rolled into Redstone Crossing just after 4 in the afternoon, and the town was awake and watching. That was the first thing she noticed. People had come out to see her, not in a welcoming way, in the way people come out to watch something they've already decided to judge. A group of women stood near the dry goods store with their arms folded. 2 men leaning against a post stopped their conversation and stared. A young girl sitting on a barrel craned her neck. Evelyn had known this was coming. She'd known it since the day her name appeared in the correspondence column, and a man from the territory had written back. She was 34 years old. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered, full-figured, with heavy hips, and a round face that didn't fit any of the narrow ideals that magazines printed for ladies' consumption. She had good skin and dark eyes that were sharp enough to make most people uncomfortable if they held her gaze too long. She was not what anyone in Redstone Crossing had been imagining. She climbed down from the stagecoach without waiting for assistance. Her boots found the ground solidly. She straightened her coat, picked up her travel bag, and looked at the man standing at the edge of the road. Samuel Mercer. She recognized him from the small portrait photograph he'd sent. Taller in person, lean in the way of men who work outdoors and don't eat enough. His jaw was set hard beneath a week of dark stubble, and his eyes brown, careful, already calculating, moved over her once and stopped somewhere around her shoulders. His expression didn't change. That was the giveaway. A man who was pleasantly surprised shows it. A man who is concealing disappointment goes very, very still. "Miss Carter," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Welcome to Redstone." "Mr. Mercer." She met his eyes directly. "Thank you for the arrangement." He nodded once. Then he looked at her trunk being unloaded from the back of the coach, and she could see him calculating the size of it, what it said about her intentions, how long she planned to stay. A woman who packed a full trunk wasn't planning to turn around. "My wagon's just there," he said. "We'll get you settled." He picked up the trunk without asking whether she needed help, which she appreciated, because she didn't want help, and she didn't want to spend the next hour reassuring him that she was capable of carrying her own belongings. She followed him to the wagon, and the women by the dry goods store whispered to each other behind gloved hands, and Evelyn didn't look at them. She looked at the road that led out of town, at the angle of the afternoon sun, at the direction his wagon was pointed, and what that told her about where his land sat relative to the creek. The ride out to the ranch was mostly silent. Samuel drove. She sat beside him and watched the land. He said at one point, "You have family in Ohio. A sister," she said, "and her husband. They know you came out here." "They do." He nodded. He didn't ask why she'd left, and she didn't offer it. There were 100 answers to that question, and none of them were simple. And she had learned a long time ago that simple questions about why a woman made the choices she made were rarely asking for the full truth. They were testing for something: weakness, desperation, damage. She wasn't going to hand him any of those. After another few minutes, he said, "I want to be straightforward with you." "I'd prefer that," she said. "The arrangement is practical. I need someone who can manage the household. I have a ranch to run, and I don't have time for—" He paused, picked his words. "I need things to run orderly. The house, the meals, the accounts. That's the expectation." "I understand." "I'm not a complicated man," he said, which she suspected was not entirely true. "I have a system. I'd like it respected." She looked at him. "And if I see a better system—" He glanced at her sideways, just a flicker, quick, almost concealed. "Beg pardon. I'm saying if I notice something that could be done more efficiently, I'd like to be able to say so." He held the reins easy in his hands. "You can say so," he said carefully. "I'll hear it." That was not a yes. She filed the distinction away. The ranch came into view around a long curve in the road, and the first thing she saw was the front yard. She didn't say anything. She sat very still and looked at it. Rows beds wide and deliberately planted, running along both sides of a gravel path. Flowering shrubs she didn't recognize immediately, but identified within a moment as purely ornamental. A low decorative fence painted white that served no structural purpose. Window boxes, planted urns, a curved garden bench. It was the front yard of a woman's house in the city. It was the front yard of someone who had money to spend on beauty and no pressure to produce anything useful from the land immediately adjacent to the front door. And behind it, she could tell even from the wagon the field stretched out with the kind of disorganized, exhausted growth that happened when no real planning had been applied to them in years. "My wife planted the garden," Samuel said. He'd caught her looking. She didn't ask about the wife. The past tense in his letters had been enough. "It's well maintained," she said. "I keep it up," he said. "It matters." She nodded and didn't argue. He showed her the house, which was clean and spare, and organized in the way of a man who had imposed order because the alternative was chaos. Everything in its place. Nothing wasted. But the pantry, she walked through it deliberately on the first pass, was thinner than it should have been. Root vegetables low. Preserved goods sparse for the season. The flour sack was less than a third full. She looked at the flour sack for a long moment, and then looked away. That night, over a meal she cooked from what the pantry offered, they sat across from each other at a table and said the necessary things. He told her how the ranch worked, the cattle, the hired hand named Dooley who came 3 days a week, the fence line that needed repair before fall, the account at the Redstone supply store that was, he paused, manageable. She knew what manageable meant when a man paused before saying it. "How long has the account been outstanding?" she asked. He looked up from his plate. "The one at the supply store," she said. You paused. His jaw tightened slightly. "Long enough." "How much?" "That's..." He stopped. "That's not your concern yet." She let it go. She'd find out. A woman who managed a household found out everything. Eventually, the ledgers, the letters, the notes tucked into drawers. Not through snooping. Through the ordinary administration of daily life, which required knowing what resources were actually available. She slept that night in the small room he'd prepared separate from his, which she thought showed either respect or relief, possibly both, and she lay in the dark and listened to the land outside. Wind moving through dry grass, a horse shifting in the stable, the distant sound of what might have been a creek. She mapped it all in her mind against what she'd seen from the road and from the wagon building, a picture of the property that was more complete than anything Samuel had walked her through in his tour. The front yard. She kept coming back to the front yard. She was up before sunrise. She didn't announce it. She pulled on her work dress, the heavy cotton one she'd packed deliberately for exactly this kind of morning, and she went outside with a cup of coffee she'd made quietly in the kitchen, and she walked the property while the sky turned from black to deep blue to the first pale gray of early light. She walked every fence line she could reach. She tested the soil in 3 places, dug down with her heel, and looked at what came up, rubbed it between her fingers, judged the moisture content and the composition. She followed the creek as far as she could go before it curved behind the neighbor's fence. She counted the feet between the road and the house and thought about traffic patterns, who passed this road, how often, what they were carrying, what they needed. She stood in the middle of the ornamental front yard as the sun broke fully over the ridge, and she looked at the roses and she thought, this is the most expensive mistake on this property. Not because roses were worthless, but because this land, this exact piece of ground positioned the way it was relative to the road, with the foot traffic and the wagon traffic she'd already observed, was the single best location on the entire property for a market stand. It was visible, it was accessible, it had the right orientation to catch people coming and going in both directions. And it was currently planted with things that produced nothing but beauty, which was a luxury Samuel Mercer could not afford. She finished her coffee. She went back inside. She found the property ledger in the desk drawer in the parlor because she looked for it methodically, and a man who said his accounts were manageable kept his ledger close enough to look at and far enough to avoid. She sat at the desk and read it cover to cover. It took her 40 minutes. When she was done, she sat very still for a moment, and then she closed the ledger quietly. He wasn't just struggling, he was in trouble. Real compounding, interest-generating trouble that another bad season would push into something unrecoverable. The cattle operation wasn't producing enough margin. The hired work cost more than the output justified. There was a note on the property, not large but not small, and the payment schedule left almost no cushion for unexpected expense. And the front yard was planted with roses. She heard him come downstairs. She replaced the ledger in the drawer and was standing at the kitchen stove when he appeared in the doorway. He was dressed for the day, hat already on his head, which meant he'd been planning to head out before breakfast, which meant he wasn't expecting her to be already in his space and already functioning. "Morning," he said, clearly recalibrating. "Sit," she said. "Breakfast is nearly ready." He sat watching her move through the kitchen. She worked efficiently. No wasted motion, no second-guessing. She'd spent 15 years running her father's household after her mother passed, and she'd run it with less than Samuel Mercer had in his pantry right now. She set the plate in front of him and sat across the table. "I read your ledger," she said. The fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "I looked for it deliberately," she continued, "because you told me the account was manageable and paused before you said it, which meant it wasn't. I wanted to know what I was working with." He set the fork down. His face had gone careful and tight in the way she was already learning was his first reaction to anything that felt like a challenge to his authority. "That's my private business," he said. "I'm your wife," she said. "It's my business too." "We haven't. The ceremony isn't—" "I know," she said. "But I am here, and I intend to be useful. And I cannot be useful if I'm managing a household without knowing what that household actually has and owes." He said nothing. His jaw was working. "You're in real trouble, Mr. Mercer," she said. Not unkindly, directly. "Another bad season and you lose the note. You know that." "I'm aware of my own situation," he said, and the flatness in his voice was a warning. "I know you are," she said. "So let me help. You're here to manage the house." "I'm here to help you survive," she said. "If you want someone to dust the parlor and arrange the dinner table, You should have found a different woman. I can do those things. But I can also see what's wrong with this ranch, and I have an idea that might fix it, and I'd like to say it without you ending the conversation." The silence stretched. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up across the grass. "Say it," he said finally. "The front yard." He looked at her. "I want to tear it out," she said. "The roses, the gravel, the decorative fence. All of it. And I want to replace it with a kitchen garden and a market stand, fast-growing vegetables, herbs, root crops, positioned for the road traffic. The railroad work crews come through this road 4 times a week according to the pattern I observed this morning. Supply wagons use it too. And they stop. People on the move stop for fresh food, especially if it's positioned before they hit town because—" "No," he said. She stopped. "No," he said again, and this time his voice had real heat in it. "That garden is— it was my wife's. Eleanor planted every one of those roses herself. I have kept them for 3 years and I am not—" He stopped. "That yard is not up for discussion." She looked at him. She saw the grief in his face, sudden and unguarded, and she knew she had found the real wall she was up against. Not pride, not stubbornness. Something much harder to argue with. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't know." "Now you do." She nodded. She picked up her fork and ate, and didn't say another word about it. But she didn't abandon it either. She gave it 3 days. She spent those 3 days doing what he needed her to do, managing the house, learning the rhythms of the kitchen and the storage, and the weekly supply schedule cooking meals that stretched the pantry further than it looked like it could go. She figured out the accounts at the supply store on her own by doing the shopping herself on the 2nd day and noting what the store owner's expression did when she gave her name. The account was in worse shape than the ledger had indicated. The numbers in the ledger were the official numbers. The real numbers included a side arrangement Samuel had apparently made for extended credit that he hadn't written down because writing it down made it too real. On the morning of the 4th day, she found Dooley the hired hand fixing a water trough behind the barn, and she said to him, "How long has the ranch been in this condition?" He looked at her sideways, assessing. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with the kind of face that had spent too many years squinting into sun and wind. "Since before I came," he said. "Maybe 6-7 years." "Since Mrs. Mercer passed," he nodded slowly. "She kept the books, did the selling, had a garden that fed half the county, not that decorative mess he keeps now. When she went—" He shook his head. "He kept the flowers, let the rest go." She thought about that for a long time after she walked back to the house. That afternoon she found Samuel in the barn mending a saddle, and she sat on a barrel near the door and watched him work for a moment. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to hear it before you respond." He kept working. "Go ahead. Your wife knew what she was doing," she said. "Eleanor. Whatever she grew in that yard, it wasn't decoration. She was a woman who understood this land. She planted roses because she loved them, but I'd wager everything I brought with me from Ohio that she also had a kitchen plot somewhere, and a system for the house, and a way of managing the margins on this ranch that kept it functional." His hand slowed. "You honored her by keeping the roses," she said. "That's a real and meaningful thing. But Eleanor didn't plant a dying ranch. You've been letting it die since she left, and the roses are not what she would have wanted you to protect." "You didn't know her," he said. Quiet, not angry, just certain. "No," she said. "But I know what she left behind." And what she left behind was a man who loved her enough to grieve for 3 years and a yard full of flowers, while the thing she actually built, this land, this ranch, fell apart around them. He was very still. "I'm not asking you to forget her," Evelyn said. "I'm asking you to let me help save what she worked for." For a long time, the only sound was the horse in the next stall shifting its weight, and the creak of the barn, settling in the afternoon heat. "How long?" he said finally, slowly. "Until you'd see any money from it." She felt something in her chest release. Not victory exactly. Something quieter. A door opening. 3 weeks to first harvest on the fastest crops, she said. 6 weeks to a proper market stand. 10 weeks before I could tell you whether it would do what I think it'll do. He picked up the saddle work again. And if it doesn't work, then you've lost a rose bed, she said. You weren't going to sell the roses anyway. He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth moved. 1 row, he said. Start with 1 row along the fence line nearest the road. We'll see. I'll need seeds, she said, and lumber. And I'll need you not to be embarrassed when people drive by and see me working. He looked up at her, then a direct assessing look she hadn't seen him give her before. Not suspicious, not reluctant, something closer to curious. I'm not easy to embarrass, he said. That was not what happened. She had the first seeds in the ground on a Saturday, working along the roadside fence line in the late afternoon when the light was still good. She'd bought the seeds herself at the dry goods store, and the woman behind the counter, a thin, sharp-featured woman named Mrs. Hartley, had looked at what she was purchasing and said with the particular precision of a woman who wants to wound without appearing to, "Gardening, are we? How practical." Evelyn had said, "I hope so," and paid for the seeds and carried them home. She planted in rows. She was fast and efficient, and very specific about spacing, because spacing was the difference between a productive row and a tangled mess that choked itself out. She was on her knees in the dirt along the fence line when she heard the wagon slow on the road. She didn't look up. The wagon didn't pass. "That's Mercer's land," she heard a man's voice say. Then after a pause, "What is she doing?" "I have no earthly idea," a woman's voice answered. "She's digging up the roses." She wasn't digging up the roses. She was planting in the narrow strip between the fence and the first rose bed. But perceptions, she knew, were faster than facts. By Sunday afternoon, 3 separate people had come by the house on pretextual errands that were actually opportunities to look at what she was doing. By Monday, she'd heard through Dooley that Mrs. Hartley at the dry goods store had told at least 2 customers that the Mercer mail-order bride was destroying the late Eleanor's garden. Samuel heard it too. He came to find her in the kitchen that evening, and his face was carrying the particular expression of a man who had been hearing things in town and was not sure how to address them without starting an argument he wasn't ready for. "People are talking," he said. "I know," she said. "About the garden." "I heard." He stood in the doorway. "Evelyn." "I planted between the beds," she said. "I haven't touched the roses. And I won't not until you give me leave to. That's not the issue, isn't the roses specifically. It's—" He rubbed the back of his neck. "It looks unusual." "A woman working her own land looks unusual." "A woman." He stopped, started again. "People here have a way of doing things, expectations." "About what a wife should look like," she said, not angrily, directly. "And about what a woman like me should content herself with." He didn't answer. "I understand those expectations exist," she said. "I've navigated them my whole life, but I didn't come here to perform normalcy for Redstone Crossing. I came here because you needed help, and I intend to provide it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The Finley brothers stopped by the supply store today and said—" He stopped. "What did they say?" "Nothing worth repeating." She looked at him steadily. "Did you correct them?" He met her eyes, held them. Something moved behind his expression. Not shame exactly. The recognition of a test he wasn't sure he'd passed. "I didn't not correct them," he said. "That's a careful answer." "It's an honest one." She nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "I'll make supper." She didn't push it. She didn't have to. She'd seen what she needed to see, that he was not an unkind man, but he was a man who cared about what Redstone Crossing thought of him, and that caring was going to be a friction point between them until the results made the conversation irrelevant. She was going to make the results irrelevant. The first seeds came up in 11 days. She'd planted radishes and green onions along the fence line, fast germination, reliable yield, visible proof of concept. She'd also put in a row of bush beans farther back and started tomato seedlings in the kitchen window, which she would transplant in another week. The morning she saw the first green shoots pushing through the red dirt, she stood at the fence line and felt something she hadn't felt since she left Ohio, a straightforward, uncomplicated satisfaction. She had put something in the ground, and it had answered her. She was still standing there when she heard footsteps behind her. Samuel coming from the barn. He stopped beside her and looked at the thin row of green. "That was fast," he said. "Radishes move," she said. "3 more weeks and they're ready." He looked at them for a moment longer. Then he said without looking at her, "I went back to the supply store this morning, settled the extended account." She turned to look at him. "Use the emergency funds," he said. "Small ones, but I wanted the account clean." He paused. It felt it needed to be done. She understood what he was telling her. He was telling her that he'd looked at his own situation more honestly, that something she'd said or done had moved him to take an action he'd been avoiding. He wasn't saying that directly, because direct credit was still difficult for him, but the message was clear enough. "That's good," she said simply. "A clean account is easier to manage." He nodded. Neither of them said anything else, but they stood there together for another minute, looking at the green shoots in the red dirt, and Evelyn thought that might be the most honest moment they'd had since she arrived. That afternoon, 2 things happened. First, a supply wagon slowed on the road as she was working the fence line, and the driver leaned out and said, "You selling anything yet, ma'am?" "Not yet," she said. 2 or 3 weeks. "What are you growing?" "Radishes now," she said. "Green onions, beans, tomatoes by end of summer. What do you need?" He scratched his chin. "Crew I'm driving for goes through a lot of onions," he said. "And bread, but that's another matter." "Come back in 3 weeks," she said. "I'll have onions." "What's your price?" She told him a number. He nodded like it was fair, which meant she'd priced it correctly, fair to him, good margin for her. He tipped his hat and drove on. She filed that conversation away. Onions, bread. Second, as she was carrying the day's tools back to the barn at dusk, she found a woman standing at the road's edge, looking at the fence line planting. Not Mrs. Hartley. Someone younger, a broad-faced, plain-dressed woman with the hands of someone who worked outdoors. "You're the Mercer bride," the woman said. "I am," Evelyn said. "Evelyn Carter." "Margaret Sauce," the woman said. "My husband's got the farm 2 miles east." She looked at the planting. "What do you know about companion planting?" Evelyn looked at her with fresh attention. "Enough," she said. "Why?" "I've got a bug problem in my bean rows and I can't figure out why," Margaret said. "I've tried 3 different things and nothing—" She paused. "My neighbor said she saw you planting and that you might know something about it." "Come around Saturday morning," Evelyn said. "I'll look at your rows." Margaret Sauce nodded, looked at the planting one more time with an expression that was not unfriendly, and walked back toward the road. Evelyn watched her go. And then she looked down at the fence line at the thin green rows coming up in the red dirt, and she thought about the supply wagon driver, and Margaret Sauce, and the railroad crew that needed onions, and the number she had written in the margin of a page she kept folded in her apron pocket. The number of wagons per week that used this road, the estimated head count of the railroad crew, the calculated margin on fast-turn vegetables at fair market price. The picture was getting clearer. It always did if you let yourself look at it long enough without blinking. She went inside and started making supper, and the house smelled like wood smoke and onions and something that was beginning slowly to feel less like obligation and more like possibility. Samuel came in from the fields as she was setting the table, and he washed up and sat down without ceremony, the way he always did. And for a moment before she brought the food over, she stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him at the table. The set of his shoulders, the way his hands rested on the wood, the particular tiredness that lived in his face at the end of a working day. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had lost something real and let the loss hollow him out in ways he hadn't fully noticed. And he'd filled the hollow with routine and appearances and roses that couldn't feed him. She could work with that. She'd worked with harder starting conditions. She brought the food to the table and sat across from him and passed the bread, and he said, "Margaret Sauce stopped by the barn while I was working this afternoon." Evelyn looked up. Said she's coming Saturday, he said. To talk beans. She has a pest problem, Evelyn said. He nodded slowly. She's a capable farmer, he said. Been running that place mostly alone since her husband's health turned. He looked at his plate. People around here, the farming people, they don't come to each other easy. It's not the custom. I know, she said. She came anyway. She needed something solved, Evelyn said. People move past custom when they need something solved. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What are you building exactly? She looked at him across the table. What do you mean? You're not just planting a garden, he said. I can see that now. The way you talked to that wagon driver this afternoon, I was at the fence on the other side of the barn. I could hear. You were pricing and planning. He held her gaze. What are you building? She set down her fork. She had not intended to lay out the full picture. Yet she'd learned early in her life that people needed to see the first results before they could imagine the larger ones, and telling them everything at once made them feel managed rather than included. But he was looking at her with a directness she hadn't seen from him before, like he'd decided to actually look. Something that doesn't depend on cattle prices or good seasons or one supply account, she said. Something that uses what's already here, the road, the traffic, the land, and turns it into consistent income. A farm stand, he said. To start, she said, and after, she picked her fork back up. Let me get the radishes to market first, she said. Then we'll talk about after. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he picked up his fork too, and they ate in a silence that was for the first time since she'd arrived not entirely uncomfortable. Outside, the wind moved through the rose beds. The green shoots along the fence line rustled in the dark. The road sat quiet under the first stars, waiting for morning, waiting for the next wagon, waiting for what this woman was just beginning to build. Saturday came with a hard wind off the ridge and a sky the color of old iron, and Evelyn was already at the fence line before Margaret Sauce arrived. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the particular rattle of a vehicle that had been repaired too many times and maintained just enough to keep moving. Margaret pulled up and climbed down without waiting for help, the same way Evelyn had climbed down from the stagecoach a week and a half ago. And Evelyn recognized that quality immediately, a woman who had long since stopped expecting assistance and had reorganized her whole body around not needing it. You said Saturday, Margaret said. I did, Evelyn said. Come on. She didn't take her to the bean rows first. She took her to the kitchen and gave her coffee because the wind was sharp and because sitting across a table from someone before you, walked their land with them, told you things about them that the land alone couldn't. Margaret Sauce sat with her hands wrapped around the cup and looked around the kitchen with the quick assessing eyes of a woman who cataloged everything and revealed nothing. How long has your husband been ill? Evelyn asked. Margaret looked at her directly. 2 years. The chest. And you've been running the farm alone that whole time? Mostly. She drank. My boy helps when he can. He's 12. Evelyn nodded. She didn't offer sympathy because Margaret's posture made it clear she hadn't come for sympathy. She'd come for the bean problem, and possibly for something she hadn't named yet. Tell me about your rows, Evelyn said. Margaret laid it out plainly. Bush beans planted in 3 rows. Reliable variety soil she'd been working for 6 years. Pest damage appearing mid-growth concentrated on the interior row, sparing the outer 2. She'd tried wood ash, she'd tried removing the affected plants, she'd tried changing her watering pattern. Evelyn listened without interrupting. You've got somethings in the soil attracting them to the center, she said when Margaret finished. Not a random infestation, a targeted one. What did you grow in that center row the season before? Margaret went still for a moment. Squash. And before that, squash again. She paused. We like squash. The root residue is feeding a specific pest population in that soil layer, Evelyn said. You need to rotate that center row to something the pest doesn't favor, brassicas or onions, and plant basil at the ends of each row. Not because it's pretty, because the oil in the leaves disrupts the feeding cycle. Margaret stared at her. Where did you learn that? My father had 40 acres in Ohio and no money for pesticide, Evelyn said. You learn what works, or you lose the crop. Something shifted in Margaret's face, not quite admiration, but the closest thing to it that a woman of her particular self-sufficiency allowed herself. She set down the coffee cup. What do you want for the advice? Evelyn looked at her. I want to know if you'd be willing to sell at a shared stand. The silence that followed was the kind that meant she'd caught the other woman off guard completely. Explain, Margaret said. Evelyn leaned forward. I'm setting up a market stand here road-facing, aimed at the railroad crew traffic and supply wagons. I can grow what I grow, but I can't grow everything. Not in one season, not starting from where I'm starting. If you brought product here 2 days a week, we split the margin. You don't have to manage the selling yourself, and we both come out better than we would alone. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Why would you share the margin? She said. You've got the stand. You've got the location. Because a stand with one farmer's product is a garden, Evelyn said. A stand with 3 is a market. Markets bring more traffic. More traffic means more sales for both of us. She held the other woman's gaze. I'm not trying to be generous, Mrs. Sauce. I'm trying to be practical. Margaret Sauce picked up her coffee cup again, drank the last of it, and set it down with a sound that was almost a decision. I'll think on it, she said. That's all I'm asking. She walked Margaret out to her wagon and watched her drive back down the road, and then she turned around and found Samuel standing at the corner of the barn watching. She'll come back, Evelyn said, walking past him. You don't know that, he said, falling into step beside her. She drove 2 miles in a cold wind to talk about beans, Evelyn said. She'll come back. He didn't argue, but he didn't agree either, which was its own kind of progress. The radishes were ready in exactly 3 weeks. She pulled the first ones on a Tuesday morning and had them washed and bundled by midday, and she set up a folding table at the edge of the road. Nothing elaborate, just the table, and a sign she'd lettered herself on a piece of board she'd asked Samuel for, and she stood behind it and waited. The first customer was a railroad survey crew, 4 men on horseback, coming through before noon. They stopped because she was there, and it was unexpected, and men on long roads stopped for unexpected things. What are you selling? The lead man asked. Radishes, green onions, she said. Fresh this morning. 3 cents a bundle. He squinted. That's fair. It's meant to be. He bought 2 bundles. The man behind him bought 1. They rode on, and she stood behind the table with 6 cents in her apron pocket and something in her chest that she recognized as proof of concept. By the end of that first Tuesday, she'd sold through half her stock. She'd had 8 customers, 4 railroad men, 2 supply wagon drivers, a farm wife passing through in a buckboard, and an elderly man who'd stopped his mule specifically because he said he hadn't seen fresh radishes at roadside since his wife passed, and he had a particular feeling about that. She gave him an extra bundle for the same price. When Samuel came back from the east fence line at dusk, she was counting the day's earnings at the kitchen table. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the coins. How much, he said. She told him. He sat down across from her, slowly, the way a man sits when something has surprised him past his usual responses. That's 1 day, he said. That's half stock, she said. I'll sell the rest tomorrow. If the crew comes through on Thursday the way they did Tuesday, and if I have twice the volume next week. She slid the paper toward him, the numbers she'd been working. He looked at them. She watched him read them, the careful tracking of his eyes across the figures the moment when he understood the projection. This is based on what he said. On the traffic I counted for 2 weeks before I planted anything, she said. On what the wagon driver told me about his crew's needs. On the prices at the supply store compared to what people will pay for fresh and roadside. She paused. On what your wife used to do according to Dooley. He looked up from the paper. He said she grew vegetables, Evelyn said carefully, that she sold them, that she fed half the county before. She stopped. I'm not trying to replace what she built. I'm trying to finish it. His hands were flat on the table. His face was doing something complicated that he was working hard to control. "The roses," he said, not a question. "Not yet," she said immediately. "I told you not until you're ready. I meant it." He nodded once, short, and then he pushed the paper back toward her and said, "What do you need for next week's stock?" That was the first time he asked her what she needed. Not what she was planning, not what she thought, what she needed. She told him. He listened. He wrote nothing down, which meant he was going to remember it, and she noted that the quality of a man who committed things to memory because he trusted himself more than paper. That night, she lay in her room and thought about Eleanor Mercer, a woman she had never met and would never meet, who had planted roses because she loved them, and vegetables because she was practical, and had somehow held both of those things in the same two hands. She thought about what it cost to love someone enough to tend their memory and what it cost to let that same memory become a cage. She thought about the 6 cents in her apron pocket and the numbers on the paper and the way Samuel's hands had gone flat on the table when she said the word roses. She had 3 weeks before the bean crop came in, 6 before the tomatoes would produce in any real quantity. She needed to get ahead of the summer supply demand before Cedric Blackwell, whose name she'd started hearing at the supply store in conversations that went quiet when she entered, noticed that she was building something outside his distribution control. She'd heard Blackwell's name 4 times in 10 days. That was enough to tell her something about him. You didn't hear a man's name that often without him being the kind of man who arranged things so his name was heard. She started asking careful questions. Dooley was her best source, because Dooley had been in Redstone Crossing for 15 years and had watched Blackwell's operation expand without ever being inside it. He told her over 3 separate conversations while she worked the garden, and he worked whatever he was working nearby, that Blackwell controlled the flour mill, 2 of the 3 primary supply routes into the territory, and the pricing on nearly every dry good that came through the region. "Does he set the prices at the store?" she asked. "Not directly," Dooley said. "But the store buys from his supply chain, so when his prices go up, theirs go up, and they go up whenever he needs them to." "Has anyone tried to route around him?" Dooley looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "People who've tried that have found their wagon contracts canceled," he said, "or their mill access cut off, or their credit at the regional bank." He stopped. "He's not a man who takes competition kindly." "He's not competition," she said. "I'm a vegetable stand." "For now," Dooley said. She heard the warning in it. She stored it carefully. Margaret Sauce came back on a Wednesday 10 days after her first visit. She drove up mid-morning, climbed down from the wagon, and walked directly to where Evelyn was working the bean rows she'd expanded behind the original fence line planting. "I'll do it," Margaret said. 2 days a week. I'll bring what I have. We split 60-40 my favor because I'm supplying from a larger operation. 55-45 your favor," Evelyn said without looking up from what she was doing. "Because I'm supplying the location, the customer relationships, and the sales." Margaret was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Done," she said. Evelyn stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. "What can you bring in volume?" "Eggs," Margaret said. "Reliable. 2 dozen, minimum 3 on good weeks. Some soft cheese if the weather holds. Dried beans by end of summer." "Eggs," Evelyn said, and she felt something click into place in the larger picture she was building. "The railroad crew goes through eggs. I've been turning them away because I don't have chickens." "I have 12 hens," Margaret said. "Then we have eggs." They shook hands at the bean rows, 2 women with dirt on their clothes and no illusions about what they were doing, and it was the most businesslike handshake Evelyn had completed since leaving Ohio. She told Samuel at dinner. He listened to the terms she'd negotiated. He ate. He said when she was done, "You gave her the better split." "She has the better operation," Evelyn said. "For now." 55-45 on eggs, he said slowly, working through the arithmetic. "If she brings 2 dozen twice a week at 8 cents the dozen roadside, which is below the store price and above what anyone else is paying for fresh," Evelyn said. We clear a margin that makes the arrangement worth it for both of us. He set his fork down. You've been pricing this out. I price everything out, she said. He looked at her across the table with an expression she was still learning to read, something between admiration and discomfort. The look of a man who was accustomed to being the one who understood numbers and was adjusting to not being that person in the room. You could have run a business, he said, not unkindly, almost carefully, like he was testing whether the statement was welcome. I am running a business, she said. And then, because she wanted to give him something, she said, Your cattle, have you thought about a direct contract with the railroad camp cook? If they're out there long enough for a crew, they need meat on a schedule, not through Blackwell's supply chain. Direct. He stared at her. I heard the survey crew talking Tuesday, she said. They're expecting the crew to be camped for at least 4 more months. The camp cook is buying supplies through Blackwell's agent, which means he's paying a 20% markup on everything and dealing with irregular delivery. She met his eyes. You have cattle. You can deliver on a schedule, cut out the markup, and you both come out ahead. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man rapidly recalculating everything he thought he understood about his own situation. I'd need to know the volume they require, he said. Then ride out to the camp tomorrow and ask, she said. Don't go through an agent, go direct. He was quiet again. Then, you figured this out from a conversation with 4 railroad men at a vegetable table. I listen, she said simply. He picked his fork back up. He ate. And then after a long moment, he said something he hadn't said before in the nearly 4 weeks she'd been on his land. Thank you, he said, for the cattle idea. It was a small thing. And it wasn't a small thing at all. The following Thursday was the day Cedric Blackwell's name stopped being something she heard in other people's conversations and became something that arrived directly in front of her. She was at the market table mid-morning with Margaret's eggs arrayed in the center and 2 varieties of fresh greens she'd brought in from the extended rows when a buckboard she didn't recognize pulled up on the road. The man who climbed down was not a railroad worker and not a farmhand, and not someone stopping because he needed fresh food. She could tell before he reached the table. He moved like a man accustomed to being the largest presence in any room, even outdoors, and he was dressed too well for a working day. Mrs. Mercer, he said. He tipped his hat with a precision that communicated courtesy and nothing beneath it. That's right, she said. Cedric Blackwell. He smiled. I've been hearing about your little operation here. She noted the word little. What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwell? He looked at the table, at the eggs, the greens, the lettered sign. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's already decided isn't a threat, but wants to examine before confirming that assessment. I make it my business to know what's happening in the regional trade, he said. New enterprises, new suppliers. I like to introduce myself early, build good relationships. That's considerate, she said. I find it practical, he said. Most small operations around here find it useful to work within my supply network. I provide access to markets' reliable pricing. We're selling directly, she said. Roadside. Of course. The smile didn't waver. That works for a vegetable stand. But as you grow, if you grow, you'll find that access to the right distribution channels makes all the difference. He paused. I can offer you preferred pricing on flour on transport contracts. A woman in your position starting fresh, building something new, those kinds of advantages matter. She looked at him steadily. What does preferred pricing on flour cost? His smile shifted, not much, barely a fraction. The shift of a man who hadn't expected the question to go directly to the terms. A percentage of your sales volume, he said. Standard arrangement. What percentage? We'd negotiate specifics once the operation is more established. Vague terms to be determined once I'm dependent on your network, she said pleasantly. That's not a preferred arrangement. That's a trap with the door left open. The smile disappeared, just briefly, 1 or 2 seconds before it reassembled. But she saw it. You're a direct woman, Mrs. Mercer. I find it practical, she said, returning his own word to him. Thank you for introducing yourself, Mr. Blackwell. If we need what you're offering, we'll know where to find you. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he tipped his hat again with the same precise courtesy, and climbed back into his buckboard and drove away. She stood behind the table and watched the buckboard until it cleared the far bend, and then she took a slow breath and looked down at her hands on the table, which were entirely steady, and she thought, so it begins. She was still thinking about Blackwell when Samuel rode in from the railroad camp late that afternoon, and she could tell before he dismounted that something had gone right. He had the particular posture of a man who has accomplished something and is not yet sure how to talk about it without sounding like he's boasting. They want a contract, he said. He tied the horse and turned around. Camp Cook wants 12 head over the next 8 weeks delivered in 2-week intervals. Evelyn looked at him. At what price? He told her. She ran the numbers instantly in her head, and the result made her look at him a half-second longer than usual. That's, she said. I know, he said. I priced it where you suggested. Below Blackwell's agent, above what I'd get at market. He shook his head slightly. The cook practically grabbed my hand before I finished the sentence. He's been fighting with the agent for 2 months over delivery delays. Did you put it in writing? We shook on it. He said a written contract comes from the railroad office and takes 6 weeks. Get something on paper before the next delivery, she said immediately. Even a letter, even informal. You need something that acknowledges the agreement. He nodded. You're right. He paused. Then, Blackwell's agent was at the camp. I saw him leaving when I arrived. She looked up. He saw me, Samuel said. He knows I talked to the cook. How quickly can he respond? Blackwell. Samuel's jaw tightened. Fast. He's got relationships at the railroad company office. If he makes a call. Then we finalize the arrangement before he makes the call, she said. Ride back out first thing tomorrow with a letter. I'll draft it tonight. He looked at her for a moment, that same assessing look she'd gotten used to, but heavier now weighted with something more than curiosity. He came here today, he said, not a question. Blackwell. Dooley saw the buckboard, recognized it. She nodded. He came to introduce himself, offered us preferred pricing in his network. Samuel's expression went very still. What did you say? I called it a trap and told him we'd find him if we needed him. Another stillness, longer this time. Evelyn, he said. I know, she said. That man controls the mill, the supply routes. If he decides we're a problem, we're already a problem, she said. We were a problem the moment I sold the first bundle of radishes outside his pricing structure. Coming to terms with his network doesn't protect us, it just makes us dependent before he moves. Samuel pulled his hat off and ran a hand through his hair in the gesture she'd learned meant he was genuinely unsettled. He could block our flour, he said. If you're planning to expand. I'm already working on that, she said. He looked at her sharply. What does that mean? She had not told him about the mill owner, yet the conversation she'd had at the dry goods store with a weathered man named Harlan Coate, who had mentioned in the particular way of someone dropping something deliberate into casual conversation, that he'd had his milling contract cut by Blackwell's network 6 months ago and was currently milling at half capacity because he couldn't secure supply agreements. She told Samuel now. All of it. Coate's situation. The half-capacity mill. The fact that Blackwell's distribution cut had been punitive retaliation for Coate, refusing to adjust his pricing structure in a way that would have made his flour unaffordable to small farms. Samuel listened. His face changed as she talked, moved through something that looked like recognition, then something harder. Coate's a good man, he said. I've known him 15 years. Then you should ride out to see him, she said. Not me, you. Because he'll trust you in a way he won't trust me yet, and what I'm going to need from him eventually is too important to approach cold. What are you going to need from him? She looked at him steadily. A milling agreement outside Blackwell's network. Direct contract fair rate locked before Blackwell can pressure him back in. Samuel was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had come up again, moving through the yard, rattling something against the barn wall. "This is not a vegetable stand anymore," he said. "It never was," she said. "Not really." He looked at her across the kitchen, this woman he'd sent for, because he needed someone to manage his parlor who had read his ledger without permission, and proposed tearing out his dead wife's roses and negotiated a split with a neighboring farmer, and stood down. Cedric Blackwell in the same afternoon. And something in his expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. It opened. Not wide, just a fraction. The way a door opens when someone finally puts the right key in and turns it carefully, not wanting to break the mechanism. "All right," he said. "I'll ride to Coates tomorrow after the camp." She nodded. She turned back to the stove. He said behind her, "Evelyn." She turned. "The roses," he said. He stopped, started again. "The bed's closest to the road. If you need that ground." He stopped again. She waited. "Eleanor would have wanted this," he said. His voice was quiet and careful and utterly unguarded. "She would have wanted the land to work. She was never the roses were for Sundays. The rest of the week she worked. I forgot that, I think. I let the grief—" He pressed his lips together. "I forgot which part was hers and which part was mine." She stood very still. "The bed's nearest the road," he said again. "When you're ready." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Not yet. The fence line planting will carry us through the next month. When we need more ground, we'll talk about it, together." He nodded once. He hung his hat on the hook by the door. He washed up in the basin. And when he sat down at the table that night, and she brought the food over and sat across from him, the silence between them was different again. Not the silence of strangers, not the silence of polite distance, but something that had texture to it. Something that had been built from something real. The morning she found the note was 11 days later. It had been tucked under the edge of her market table, which meant someone had placed it during the night or very early in the morning before she arrived. It was not signed. It said in a plain, careful hand, "Supply contract for your beans has been flagged for review. Suggest you reconsider your distribution arrangements before the milling season." She stood at the table and read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and stood straight and waited for the first customer of the day. She would tell Samuel tonight. She would not change a single thing about today's work. She would not react visibly, because visible reaction was exactly what the note was designed to produce, the feeling of being watched, of being vulnerable, of being small. She sold through her entire stock before noon. Margaret arrived with the eggs at 10:30, and they moved through the morning with the particular rhythm they'd developed over 3 weeks, the comfortable efficiency of two women who understood each other's capabilities without having to discuss them much. Between customers, Margaret said, "Blackwell's man was at my farm yesterday." Evelyn looked at her. "Offered to buy my eggs wholesale," Margaret said. "Better rate than I'm getting here." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I had a standing arrangement," Margaret said. "He said standing arrangements with—" She paused. "He had particular words for you. I won't repeat them." "I can imagine them," Evelyn said. "He said the arrangement wouldn't last," Margaret said. "That you were overreaching and the region would correct itself." "The region is correcting itself," Evelyn said, "just not in the direction he means." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I turned him down." "I know," Evelyn said. "You weren't worried I wouldn't." "I thought you might," Evelyn said honestly. "The rate he offered you was real. What I'm offering you is a partnership that requires patience." She met the other woman's eyes. "I'm glad you stayed." Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the closest thing to warmth she typically produced. "I've got 4 more neighbors thinking about bringing product," she said. 2 of them are thinking about it because Blackwell's network shorted them on their spring supply, and they're angry enough to do something different. Evelyn went still. "Who?" she said. Margaret told her. 2 names. One had a surplus of preserved fruits. One had winter squash in quantity and a smokehouse. "Bring them Saturday," Evelyn said. "Both of them. To the house for coffee. You'll deal with 4 suppliers from a fence-line table, Margaret said. Not for long, Evelyn said. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Redstone Crossing, she let herself think past the stand, past the fence line, past the 2 acres of working garden she was building. She let herself think about what this road could look like in 6 months if every farm within riding distance was routing product through a single coordinated point instead of fighting Blackwell's network individually. The last customer of the morning was a man she hadn't seen before. Heavy-set, expensively dressed in the way of someone who spent money on appearances while keeping accounts. He looked at her table. He looked at her. He purchased nothing. As he turned to leave, he said almost offhandedly, "Word of advice, ma'am. Regional commerce has a way of dealing with disruptions. Best to stay in your lane." She smiled at him pleasantly. "I appreciate the counsel," she said. He drove away. She watched him go. Margaret was beside her. Blackwell's man. "Either that or someone who wants me to think so," Evelyn said. "Either way, same message." "Are you frightened?" Margaret said. Not unkindly. Directly the way Margaret asked everything. Evelyn thought about it honestly. "A little," she said. "But I was frightened on the stagecoach coming here, and I was frightened the first morning I walked Samuel's land and saw what he was actually sitting on, and I've been a little frightened every day since." She looked at the road. "Fear means you understand what you're doing is real. It doesn't mean you stop." Margaret was quiet. Then she said, "Saturday. I'll bring them." Evelyn nodded. She began folding up the table for the day, and the road was empty in both directions, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of the railroad crew working metal-on-metal, voices carried on the wind. And she thought about flour, and milling contracts, and 4 names that were becoming a network, and the folded note in her apron pocket, and a man who had driven away from her table without buying anything. She thought about all of it, and she kept folding the table, and she went inside to write a letter to Harlan Coate that Samuel could carry to him in the morning, and she did not let her hands shake while she wrote it. The letter to Harlan Coate took her 3 drafts. Not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because she needed to say it in a way that didn't sound like desperation, and didn't sound like a woman overreaching her position, and those 2 things in combination required care. She wrote it plain. She laid out what she was building, what she would need from a milling arrangement in volume terms, what she could offer in return by way of consistent contract and fair pricing. And she closed it with a single line that she'd thought about carefully. "A man whose capacity is being deliberately strangled by another man's greed deserves a partnership that treats him like the asset he actually is." She read it once more. Then she folded it and sealed it and set it on the table for Samuel to take in the morning. He left before sunrise. She heard him moving through the house in the dark, heard the horse in the yard, heard the gate, and then silence. She lay still for another few minutes, and then got up, because lying still when there was work to do was a habit she'd never been able to maintain. Saturday came faster than she expected. She had spent 4 days preparing for it without appearing to prepare, making enough coffee, making sure the kitchen table could seat 6 if needed, thinking through what each potential supplier needed to hear versus what they needed to feel before they'd commit to anything. There was a difference. People who were frightened of Blackwell needed to hear that there was safety in coordination. People who were angry at him needed to feel that their anger had somewhere productive to go. She had to read the room fast and adjust. Margaret arrived first, which was expected. She arrived with 2 people Evelyn had not met, a broad man named Dutch Farner, who had the surplus preserved fruit, and a smaller, quieter woman named Ada Pryor, whose smokehouse and winter squash represented the kind of volume that could change the arithmetic of the whole arrangement significantly. They sat around the kitchen table and Evelyn poured coffee and didn't waste time. "I want to be straight with all of you," she said, "because I think straight is the only thing that works when what we're trying to do is this. Blackwell controls this region's supply network through volume and pressure. He's not illegal. He's just too large and too aggressive for any one of us to route around alone." She looked at each of them. Together is a different question. Dutch Farner crossed his arms. "You're talking about a cooperative arrangement." "I'm talking about a market," she said. Coordinated supply, shared location. My stand, your product split margins that beat what you're getting through any other channel. She paused. And a combined volume that starts to matter to buyers Blackwell hasn't locked up yet. What buyers? Ada Pryor said. Her voice was quiet but direct. The railroad contract Samuel secured is the beginning, Evelyn said. They need more than beef. They need preserved goods, dried product, smoked meat on a schedule. If we can supply that contract as a group instead of individually, we become the reliable source. She let that sit for a moment. Reliable source is worth more than any individual farm can charge. It's worth a premium. Dutch uncrossed his arms, slowly. Blackwell will move on this the moment he sees the volume. He's already moving, Evelyn said. He sent someone to Margaret. He sent someone to my table. He put a note under my market stand in the dark of night. She said it flatly, without drama. He's already decided we're a problem. The question is whether we're a problem that folds or a problem that compounds. Ada Pryor looked at her steadily. You're not from here. No, Evelyn said. You don't know what he's done to people who pushed back. Tell me, Evelyn said. Ada was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 3 years ago, the Halsey farm tried to sell direct to the railroad on the Southern line. Blackwell got their wagon contracts canceled inside 2 weeks. They lost their transport, couldn't move product, went under by fall. The kitchen was very still. The Halseys were alone, Evelyn said. We are not. We're 4 people around a table, Dutch said. We're 4 farms, she said. With combined output that, if I've counted correctly from what Margaret has told me, represents a meaningful percentage of the local production Blackwell's network depends on. We are not the Halseys. She looked at him directly. And I am not asking you to go to war with him. I am asking you to sell your preserved fruit through my stand to the railroad contract instead of through his network. That's all. You don't fight him. You just stop feeding him. Another silence. Longer. Dutch looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at her coffee cup. Ada Pryor looked at Evelyn. If he cuts our transport, Ada said. Then we share transport, Evelyn said. Samuel has a wagon. Dutch. She looked at him. You have 2, Margaret told me. We wrote together. That costs time, Dutch said. It costs less than Blackwell's margin, she said. And she pushed a paper across the table. The numbers she'd worked the night before, conservative estimates, 2 scenarios. One with Blackwell's current pricing structure eating into their margins, and one without it. She'd done it carefully, without making the independent scenario look better than it was, just accurate. Dutch looked at the paper. His jaw moved. Ada leaned in to read over his shoulder. Margaret said nothing. She'd already made her decision 11 days ago, and she wasn't the kind of woman who revisited it for drama. Dutch set the paper down. I want to see the contract with the railroad first. I'll have a copy for you by Wednesday, Evelyn said. She didn't have it yet. She was going to make sure she had it by Wednesday. And if this goes wrong, Dutch said, if Blackwell comes at us hard, then we deal with that together, she said. I can't promise you he won't push back. I can promise you I won't walk away from this, and I won't make a separate arrangement with him behind your backs. She held his gaze. That's what I have to offer. The numbers, the location, and the fact that I mean what I say. Dutch looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup, drank, set it down. Wednesday, he said. Show me the contract. Ada Pryor said same. Evelyn nodded. She refilled the coffee without ceremony, and the conversation moved to logistics, product schedules, delivery timing, pricing coordination. And by the time they left an hour later, she had the outline of something that was no longer a fence-line vegetable stand. She was still at the table making notes when Samuel came back in the mid-afternoon. He'd been to Coates Mill after the railroad camp. He sat down across from her without taking his coat off. Coat will do it, he said. She looked up. He read your letter twice, Samuel said. He didn't say anything for about a minute. Then he said... He paused, almost smiling, which was a thing she hadn't seen him do fully yet. He said any woman who could write a letter like that about fair dealing deserved fair dealing in return. She felt something warm move through her chest. What are the terms? Samuel laid it out. Fair milling rate locked for 1 year, deliverable on a 2-week cycle, payment in arrears 30 days. Standard terms for a good faith arrangement, which was exactly what she'd asked for in the letter. He's taking a risk, she said. He knows, Samuel said. He said Blackwell's been squeezing him for 2 years, and he's running at half capacity, and he'd rather go down swinging than go down cooperating. He paused. His words. Then we protect him, she said. The contract volume we route through him needs to be consistent enough that Blackwell cutting him would visibly disrupt the railroad supply. That's the protection, make him indispensable to something Blackwell can't afford to disrupt. Samuel was watching her with that look again. The open one. Dutch and Ada, he said. Wednesday, she said. If I have the written contract, I can have something from the camp cook by Tuesday, he said. It won't be formal, but it'll be on railroad letterhead, which is enough to show good faith. Tuesday, she said. Good. He pulled his coat off finally and hung it on the hook. He stood at the basin washing up, and she went back to her notes, and for a few minutes the kitchen was just the sound of water and pen on paper and the wind outside, and it was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing she had felt in a long time. Then Samuel said from the basin without turning around, The Finley brothers were in town when I came through. She kept writing. And they were talking about you, he said. At the feed store. I heard it when I came in. She put the pen down. He turned around. His face was set in a way she hadn't seen before, not the careful, controlled set of a man managing his pride, but something more direct. Something that had been decided. I corrected them, he said. She looked at him. Both of them, he said. I told them that my wife was running the most productive operation on this road, and that their opinions on her methods or her... He stopped. Their opinions were not welcome and not accurate. She didn't say anything for a moment. What did they say? She said finally. Not much, he said. Men like that don't say much when you're standing close enough. He turned back to the basin. Just so you know. She picked up the pen. She looked at the paper. She didn't write anything for a moment. Thank you, she said. He made a sound that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite dismissal, somewhere between the two. The sound of a man who has done a thing and doesn't need to be thanked for it, but isn't going to say that either. She went back to her notes. He moved to the stove to start the fire for dinner, and something in the room had shifted again, incrementally, quietly, the way the most real things always shifted. The trouble arrived on a Monday, which was in her experience when trouble preferred to arrive when the week was freshest and defenses were lowest. She was at the market table when the supply wagon that had been stopping reliably every Thursday failed to appear. She noted the absence. She didn't react to it. Tuesday passed the same way. A wagon she'd expected from a driver who had bought consistently for 3 weeks came through without stopping, the driver keeping his eyes forward on the road. She watched the wagon pass. She filed it. Wednesday she was at Dooley's side of the barn when he said without preamble, Heard Blackwell's pulled the wagon contracts for 3 drivers who were stopping here. She stopped what she was doing. Which 3? He named them. 2 of them were the most consistent buyers she'd had. The third was the driver who had first asked her about onions on the day she'd planted the fence line. He can do that legally, she said. He owns the contracts, Dooley said. He can pull them for any reason. These drivers work for operators who depend on Blackwell's routes. When he says, stop buying from someone, they stop. She stood very still. The loss of 3 consistent customers was not catastrophic in the immediate term. But it was a message, and the message was, I can reduce your revenue without touching you directly. He's not trying to destroy us yet, she said. He's trying to make us uncomfortable enough to negotiate. That's how he usually starts, Dooley said. He was quiet. Then, don't wait too long to move your next step, Mrs. Mercer. He gets more comfortable the longer he sits in the pressure. She rode out to Dutch Farner's farm that afternoon herself, without sending Samuel, because this conversation required her to be there in person. Dutch met her at the gate. He read her face before she said anything. "He moved on you," Dutch said. "Pulled 3 of my wagon buyers," she said. "Yours may be next. I want you to know before it happens." Dutch looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who made decisions slowly and kept them. "Are you pulling back?" "No," she said. "Then neither am I," he said. "I've got the railroad letter." "Samuel will bring it tomorrow morning," she said. "I have another question." He waited. "Your 2 wagons," she said. "If I coordinate a twice-weekly route that picks up from you, Ada, and Margaret, and delivers to the railroad camp, cutting the independent drivers we've been depending on, can you run it? Cost." She named a figure. He countered. They settled in the middle in under 3 minutes, which told her he'd been thinking about this possibility already, maybe before she had. She rode back to the ranch in the last of the afternoon light, and the road was empty, and the sky was enormous, and she turned over numbers in her head the whole way, recalculating, restructuring, adjusting the model to run without the wagon drivers Blackwell had pulled. It was tighter. It was workable. It required the railroad contract to carry more weight than she'd originally planned, which meant she needed that contract formalized faster than Tuesday. She had Samuel ride to the camp that night. She wrote a note to the camp cook explaining the timeline pressure, not the full picture, just the functional part, that they needed a written acknowledgement of the arrangement within 48 hours to proceed with the supply schedule as planned. Samuel was back by 10 o'clock. The cook had signed a letter by lamplight and sent it back with him. She read it at the kitchen table, then looked up at Samuel. "Did he ask why the hurry?" she said. "He asked," Samuel said. "I told him we had a supply coordination challenge and we're locking down the chain." "What did he say?" "He said he didn't care about our supply chain as long as his beef arrived on schedule." Samuel sat down. "Which it will." She nodded. She set the letter down. Then she said, "Blackwell is going to move on the flour next." Samuel went still. "He'll pressure the mill before Coates' arrangement is locked," she said. "I don't have a formal contract with Coate yet. Just a conversation and a handshake that Samuel Mercer witnessed." She looked at him. "I need you to ride to Coates tomorrow with a proposed written agreement. I'll draft it tonight." "Tonight," he said. "Now," she said. He didn't argue. He got up and put more wood on the stove so the kitchen would stay warm, and she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and started drafting. She wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, Samuel was still at the table. He'd fallen half asleep in the chair, which she'd have felt guilty about if there had been time for guilt. She put the draft in front of him, and he read it fully awake in the way of people who slept lightly. "This locks him in for 18 months instead of 1 year, Samuel said. "Yes," she said. He agreed to 1 year. "I'm going to ask him for 18, she said. "The longer the lock, the more protection he has from Blackwell's pressure. He can refuse the extension, but I think he'll take it." Samuel read the rest of the draft. He made 2 small corrections language that Coate would find more natural terms that reflected how he knew the man spoke. She took the corrections without argument because they were right. "Can you be there when the mill opens?" she said. "I'll leave before light," he said. She nodded. She gathered the papers. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression she'd been trying to identify for weeks and had finally, in this moment, recognized. It was the way a man looked at someone he trusted, not someone he was obligated to, not someone he was managing or being managed by. Someone he trusted the way you trusted a partner who had shown you through accumulated evidence that they were worthy of it. She had not been looking for that. She had not expected it, not here, not this fast. Not from a man who'd greeted her off a stagecoach with the careful stillness of concealed disappointment. She said, "Get some sleep." He said, "You too." Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he stood, took the lamp, and went to bed. And she sat at the table in the dark for a while longer, thinking about nothing specific and everything at once. Coate agreed to 18 months. Samuel was back by noon with a signed agreement, and he put it on the table in front of her, and she looked at it, and then looked at him, and said, "How did he respond when you asked for the extension?" He said 18 months was generous, and he'd take 24 if she was offering. Samuel said. He was almost smiling again. His words. She felt the laugh before it came sudden real, the kind of laugh that happened when something went better than planned, and the relief came out sideways. Samuel looked startled for a moment, then something in his face relaxed in a way she hadn't seen. "Lock it in the safe box," she said. "Both copies." That was Wednesday. On Friday, Cedric Blackwell came back. This time he didn't come alone. He came with a man she didn't recognize, taller, with the particular stillness of someone paid to be present rather than to talk. They pulled up in the same buckboard, and Blackwell climbed down with his precise, controlled courtesy, and he walked to the market table and looked at it, and then looked at her. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I heard you've been busy." "I'm always busy," she said. "I heard you've been coordinating with Coates Mill," he said, "and with several of the local farms." He paused. "That's ambitious." "It's practical," she said. "It's a challenge to an established system," he said. "And I want to be clear with you as a courtesy which I think you deserve, that challenges to established systems in this region have historically not ended well for the challenger." She looked at him steadily. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwell?" "I'm informing you," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" she said. He leaned forward slightly. "I can make this road very difficult for you," he said, his voice dropping. "The wagon traffic you've been building, the suppliers you've been aggregating. I have relationships with every operator in this territory, and I can redirect that traffic away from this stand in 2 weeks. You'll be sitting here with product and no buyers." "And Coat," she said. "Can you redirect his capacity too?" The smile thinned. "Coat is a small operation with a documented history of unreliable output. His mill license comes up for review in 4 months. That was new. She hadn't known about the mill license. She kept her face neutral. "I see," she said. "I thought you'd want to know," he said, "before you committed further resources to an arrangement that may not last the season." "I appreciate the information," she said. "Was there anything else?" He studied her. "You're not going to negotiate." "I don't have anything to negotiate with yet," she said. "You've told me what you can do. I've listened. If you'd like to tell me what you want, I'll listen to that too." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Come into my network. I'll offer you preferred supplier status. Your product, your prices sold through my distribution channels to buyers you don't have access to yet. I'll cut you in fairly." "Fairly by your definition," she said. "Fairly enough," he said. "Better than what happens to people who push against me." She held his gaze. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. He turned to go. "Mr. Blackwell," she said. He turned back. "The mill license review," she said. "That's with the county office." A pause. "County and territory jointly." "Thank you," she said pleasantly. She looked back at her table. He stood there for one more moment. She could feel it without looking up. And then she heard his boots on the road and the sound of the buckboard, and she waited until it was fully gone before she let herself exhale. Dooley appeared from behind the barn. He'd been close enough to hear. "Well," he said. "I need to know everything about that mill license," she said immediately. "Who reviews it? What the criteria are? Whether there are any outstanding complaints on record." "I know someone at the county office," Dooley said slowly. "Not a friend exactly, but someone who owes me a fair conversation." "Have that conversation today," she said. He nodded once and went to saddle his horse. She stood at the table for a moment after he left alone on the road, and she thought about the man with the precise courtesy and the thin smile and the absolute confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged, and she thought about what it meant that he had come back himself instead of sending another representative. Men like Blackwell sent representatives when they were managing. They came themselves when they were concerned. He was concerned. That meant she was already further along than he'd expected. She thought about Harlan Coate and his mill license and the 4 months she hadn't known she had. She thought about Dutch Farner's 2 wagons and Ada Pryor's smokehouse, and Margaret's 12 hens, and the railroad camp cook, who had signed a letter by lamplight because he didn't care about supply chains as long as his beef arrived. She thought about Samuel, who had stood in a feed store and corrected the Finley brothers without being asked, and had ridden out before light 2 mornings running and brought back agreements she needed, and had looked at her across a dark kitchen table with the expression of a man who had started trusting someone without quite meaning to. The next customer arrived, a woman in a farm buckboard with a child beside her, and Evelyn straightened and smiled, and named the prices clearly, and sold through the morning stock, without counting how many times she thought about the mill license review, which was 4. When Samuel came home that evening and she told him all of it, Blackwell's visit, the threat, the mill license, he was very quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "What do you need? Not what are you going to do? Not how serious is this? Not maybe we should reconsider. What do you need?" "I need to know if there's a lawyer in Redstone Crossing who isn't in Blackwell's pocket," she said. "Jonas Aldridge," Samuel said without hesitating. "He handled Eleanor's estate. Straight man. Blackwell tried to hire him twice, and he turned it down both times." "Can you get him here tomorrow?" "I'll go tonight," Samuel said. He stood up from the table, reached for his coat. "Samuel," she said. He stopped. "We're going to be all right," she said. Not because she was certain she wasn't, but because he needed to hear it stated plainly, and because the part of her that had been calculating the odds since Blackwell drove away had concluded that they were better than even if they moved fast and stayed coordinated. He looked at her. His hand was on his coat, and his face was doing that open thing again, unguarded real. "I know," he said, and then quieter, "because of you." She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure one was needed. He put on his coat and went out into the night, and she sat at the table and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and started mapping everything she knew about the mill license process, filling in blanks as she went, leaving space for what Dooley would bring back in the morning. Outside, the road was quiet. The rose beds rustled in the dark. And deep in the ground in the rose she'd planted 5 weeks ago, and the rose she'd planted 3 weeks ago, and the rose she'd added last week. When she saw the trajectory. Clearly things were growing in the dark, the way they did steadily, without announcing themselves, pushing toward the surface with the particular patience of things that were rooted deep and knew the direction of the light. Jonas Aldridge arrived the next morning before the market table was even set up. He was a compact man in his 60s with the kind of face that had been weathered into something permanent and trustworthy, the way good wood got when it had been through enough seasons to prove its grain. He carried a leather case that had seen considerable use, and he shook Evelyn's hand before Samuel's, which she noted, and then he sat down at the kitchen table and opened the case and said, "Tell me everything. Start at the beginning and don't skip the parts that seem small." She told him everything. She did not skip the small parts. He listened without interrupting, which was the mark of a man who understood that interrupting a woman who was laying out a legal situation was how you missed the detail that mattered. He made notes in a small book with a pencil he kept behind his ear. When she finished, he read back through his notes for a moment and then looked up. "The mill license," he said. "That's the pressure point." "I know," she said. "Coates' license comes up for joint county and territory review in 4 months, Aldridge said. "I know the process. I've handled 2 license renewals in the past decade. The criteria are operational output records, safety compliance, debt status." He paused. "Blackwell can file a complaint that triggers an early review. If the complaint has any documented basis, the review board has to act on it." "Does he have a basis?" Evelyn said. "That's what I need to find out," Aldridge said. He looked at Samuel. "Coates' debt status, do you know it?" "Clean," Samuel said. "He told me himself, and I believe him. The half-capacity issue is revenue, not debt. He's been running lean but solvent." "Then a complaint would have to be operational or safety-based," Aldridge said. "Which means Blackwell would need to manufacture one or wait for a genuine incident." He tapped his pencil on the table. 4 months is not a lot of time, but it's enough if we move correctly." He looked at Evelyn. "What I can do is file a preemptive documentation package with the county office Coates operational records, safety history, revenue trajectory." Get it on record before any complaint is filed. It doesn't prevent a review, but it establishes the baseline so clearly that a manufactured complaint looks manufactured. How fast can you do that? She said. 2 weeks if Coat cooperates fully. He'll cooperate, Samuel said. Then 2 weeks, Aldridge said. He closed his notebook. The other issue is the wagon contracts. Blackwell pulling the contracts of drivers who stop here, that's legal as you know. But there may be a restraint of trade argument if we can document a pattern of targeted economic coercion. He paused. It's a slow legal road, months possibly longer. It won't protect you in the short term. I'm not asking for legal protection in the short term, Evelyn said. I'm asking for legal protection in the long term. In the short term, I'll handle it myself. Aldridge looked at her with the careful attention of a man who had seen a lot of people make confident statements and knew the difference between confidence built on nothing and confidence built on something real. What does handling it yourself look like? He said. It looks like giving Blackwell a problem that's more expensive to pursue than to leave alone, she said. He nodded slowly. I'd prefer not to know the specifics of that, he said, which was the most useful thing a lawyer had ever said to her. He left an hour later with a list of documents she'd give him, and a timeline she'd agreed to, and a handshake that meant something because Aldridge was the kind of man whose handshakes meant something. She stood at the gate watching him go, and Samuel stood beside her. He's good, Samuel said. He's the right kind of good, she said. He thinks ahead. She had 3 things to do before the end of the week, and she did them in order of urgency. First, she rode to Coates' mill herself, not Samuel this time herself, because Coate needed to see her face when she told him about the license threat, and because how he reacted to her specifically was information she needed. Harlan Coate was a lean, tall man in his late 50s, with flour permanently in the creases of his hands and eyes that moved quickly and assessed without appearing to. He read the concern in her face before she'd said a word. He threatened the license, Coate said. He told me it was up for review in 4 months, she said. He didn't threaten directly. He informed me. Same thing with Blackwell, Coate said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his mill, the sound of it, the particular rhythm of machinery that had been running at half its capacity for 6 months. I've been waiting for this. I knew when I signed with you that he'd come for the license eventually. Aldridge is filing a preemptive documentation package, she said. 2 weeks. Something in Coates' posture changed not much, but measurably. The particular release of a man who has been holding a weight alone and has just had someone put their hands on the other side of it. Jonas Aldridge, he said. Yes. Good man, Coates said. All right. He straightened. What do you need from me to make the package airtight? She told him. He had everything she asked for. They worked through it at his desk for 2 hours, pulling records, organizing the documentation, noting the gaps, and filling them. By the time she left, the file was nearly complete, and Coates' expression had moved from braced tension to something that looked almost like forward motion. Riding back, she turned over the second problem, the wagon traffic. 3 drivers pulled, potentially more coming. She needed buyers who weren't dependent on Blackwell's transport contracts, and she needed them before the gap in her revenue became a gap she couldn't close with the railroad contract alone. She was still turning it over when she came through town and saw outside the dry goods store a wagon she recognized. One of the railroad survey crew, not the Camp Cook supply wagon, but the crew's own transport, the one that moved the surveying equipment along the line. The driver was a young man she'd sold to twice, and he was loading goods from the store. She stopped her horse. Excuse me, she said. He looked up. You're with the survey crew, she said. Yes, ma'am. Who arranges your supply purchases? Is it the camp cook, or does the crew lead handle it? He thought about it. Crew lead for equipment, cook for food. Why? Because I'd like to speak to your crew lead about a standing arrangement, she said. Not food, materials. Does your crew need anything that a farm-based operation might supply lumber, rope, preserved goods for extended camp setups? He looked at her with the careful curiosity of a young man being asked a question he hadn't expected. We go through the supply agent usually, he said. But, he paused. Mr. Voss, that's the crew lead. He's been complaining about the agent's pricing on rope and canvas. Says we're paying double what it's worth. Where is Mr. Voss right now? She said. At the camp, he said. He'll be in town Thursday. Tell him Evelyn Mercer on the Mercer Road would like 5 minutes of his time, she said. Tell him I can discuss rope and canvas pricing. He said he would. She rode on. She told Samuel that evening, and he looked at her with the expression she now recognized as his version of impressed, which was a very compressed version of most people's impressed and therefore easy to miss. You're expanding the product line, he said. I'm expanding the buyer list, she said. Product line comes from what the buyer needs. If Voss needs rope and canvas, and Dutch can source it, or I can source it around Blackwell's markup. Dutch, Samuel said slowly. Dutch Farner's brother works at the cordage supplier in Dalton Creek. She looked up from her notes. He mentioned it once months ago, Samuel said. I didn't think about it until just now. Is the brother in a position to sell direct? I don't know, Samuel said, but I can find out. Find out tomorrow, she said. He found out. Dutch's brother was not only in a position to sell direct, he was actively looking for buyers outside Blackwell's distribution network because Blackwell's network had delayed his last 3 shipments and blamed weather that hadn't existed. He could supply rope and canvas and basic hardware at 30% below the current regional market price. 30%. When Samuel reported this back to her, she sat very still for a moment and then said, This is not a farm stand anymore. No, Samuel said. It is not. We need to tell Dutch, she said. He already knows, Samuel said. I rode to his farm after I talked to the brother. Dutch near fell off his chair. He paused. He wants to formalize a written arrangement between his brother's supply and our operation. Aldridge can draft it, she said immediately. Along with the coat documentation. I'll talk to him tomorrow. There's one more thing, Samuel said. She looked at him. His expression had shifted something careful in it. Blackwell raised the flour price at the store today, he said. 20%. She felt the number land. When? This morning. Mrs. Hartley told me when I came through. Said it happened overnight, new price sheet from Blackwell's supply agent. He held her gaze. It's not aimed at the store. The store passes it on. It's aimed at the bakers. The bakers. She'd been in conversation with 2 bakers in town, a woman named Ruth Pasley, who ran the only bakery in Redstone Crossing, and a man named Cal Obert, who baked for the railroad camp. Both of them depended on flour. Both of them would feel a 20% price increase immediately. He's squeezing toward us, she said. If the bakers can't afford flour, they can't buy from the market. If they can't buy from the market, our volume drops, Samuel said, and Coates' milling income drops with it, which makes his license renewal case weaker. It was a precise move. She hadn't expected precision from Blackwell. She'd expected blunt force. Precision was harder to counter. She was at Ruth Pasley's bakery before noon. Ruth was a stout, flour-dusted woman in her 40s who had been running her bakery for 12 years and had the particular exhausted resilience of someone who had survived thin seasons and bad harvests and one fire and had simply kept baking through all of it. She looked at Evelyn across the counter and said, I heard you were the one taking on Blackwell. I'm not taking on anyone, Evelyn said. I'm building a supply network outside his pricing structure. I'm here because his flour increase just made that relevant to you. Ruth looked at her steadily. How relevant? I have a milling arrangement with Harlan Coat, Evelyn said. Locked rate 18 months. If you buy flour through our cooperative arrangement, instead of through the store's supply chain, you pay the locked rate plus a small coordination fee that still comes out significantly below Blackwell's new price. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. A customer came in, bought a loaf, left. Ruth watched the door close. If Blackwell finds out I'm buying through you, she started. He'll find out, Evelyn said honestly. I won't pretend otherwise. But you're already being squeezed. This price increase is the first, not the last. The question isn't whether he's going to pressure you. It's whether you face it alone or with a network that has legal documentation, a locked supply contract, and more people in it than he can individually target. Ruth looked at her. You're asking me to trust you. I'm asking you to trust the math, Evelyn said. She put the numbers on the counter. Ruth looked at them. She read them twice slowly, the way of a woman who had kept her own books for 12 years and knew what numbers meant and what they were hiding. Cal Obert, Ruth said. The railroad baker. Does he know about this? You're the first person I've asked, Evelyn said. I wanted to ask you first because your operation is more exposed, you're in town, more visible. If you say yes, I'll go to Cal. If you say no, I'll understand why, and I won't hold it against you. Ruth Pasley looked at the numbers for another moment. Then she looked up at Evelyn with the expression of a woman who had been waiting without quite knowing it for someone to offer her a door that opened in a different direction. Get me Cal Obert's agreement first, she said. I don't want to be the only baker on this side of the line. Give me 2 days, Evelyn said. Cal Obert agreed in a single conversation that lasted less than 20 minutes, because Cal Obert was a man who had been doing math on his flour costs for 3 months and had already arrived at the conclusion that Blackwell's pricing was going to make his camp contract unworkable by fall. He didn't need persuading. He needed a specific offer with specific terms which Evelyn gave him. She had Ruth's commitment by the end of the following day. That was the week the operation stopped being something Blackwell could manage with pulled wagon contracts and price increases. That was the week it became something he had to actively fight, which was a different kind of problem for him, because fighting required expenditure and visibility and the possibility of losing. She knew he understood this the day he sent someone to the county office to file a preliminary complaint against Coates Mill. Dooley brought her the news on a Thursday morning, standing at the edge of the garden while she worked the way he always delivered uncomfortable information nearby, matter-of-fact, without ceremony. Complaint filed yesterday afternoon, he said. Operational irregularity, which is vague enough to require a response, but specific enough to trigger a preliminary review. She kept working. Did Aldridge's documentation go in? Filed 3 days ago, Dooley said. Then the complaint lands on top of a complete operational record, she said. They can't ignore it, but they can't act fast without looking arbitrary. She sat back on her heels. Who filed the complaint? Blackwell directly. Through an agent, Dooley said. A man named Griggs, who files complaints on behalf of various business interests in the territory. He paused. Griggs has filed 11 complaints in the past 5 years. 10 of them resulted in license reviews. 7 of those reviews resulted in restrictions or closures. She heard the number, 7 out of 10. How many of those operations had preemptive documentation on record? She said. Dooley was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said. Find out, she said. He found out by the following morning. None of them, not one of the 7 closed operations, had filed any preemptive documentation. She told Aldridge. He was quiet on his end of the conversation for a moment, and then he said with the particular satisfaction of a man who liked winning on technicality. Then we've already done something none of Blackwell's previous targets did. That matters. Is it enough? She said. It's the foundation, he said. I need to appear before the review board in person and make the case that the complaint is retaliatory and without operational basis. Can Coate produce 3 months of output records showing consistent performance? He can produce 6, she said. 6 is better, Aldridge said. Have them to me by Monday. She had them to him by Saturday because Coate delivered them personally to her door on Friday evening with the quiet urgency of a man who understood that the license was the hinge everything else swung on. He sat at her kitchen table while Samuel made coffee, which was a thing Samuel had started doing without being asked sometime in the past 2 weeks. And Coate said, looking at the stack of records he'd brought, I've been running this mill for 22 years. I built it myself. My father helped me pour the foundation. I know, Evelyn said. Blackwell tried to buy me out 4 years ago, Coate said. Offered fair money. I said no because I knew what fair money from Blackwell meant. It meant he'd price me out the moment the deed transferred. He looked at her. I've been fighting him alone since. This is the first time I felt like I had... He stopped. Back up, Samuel said quietly from the stove. Coat nodded. Back up, he said. It sounded like a thing he hadn't said in a long time. She didn't have an answer for that either. She seemed to be running out of answers for the moments that mattered most, which she was beginning to think was all right. Some moments didn't need answers. They just needed to be acknowledged. Your records are solid, she said. Aldridge will do the rest. The storm came on a Sunday, which was the day she'd been planning to move the first coordinated delivery to the railroad camp, Dutch's wagon loaded with preserved goods. Margaret's eggs packed in sawdust. Her own produce plus Cal. Obert's baked goods, all moving together in a single organized supply run that would demonstrate to the camp cook what a coordinated operation looked like. The storm was not a gentle one. It came fast and cold off the ridge, the kind of weather that turned roads to mud and creek crossings dangerous within an hour of starting. She stood at the door and listened to it build, and thought about the delivery schedule, and the camp cook's expectation, and the fact that missing this delivery, the first coordinated one, would say something she couldn't afford it to say. We can't move the wagon in this, Samuel said behind her. I know, she said. The creek crossing at Bender's Ford will be impassable by noon. I know, she said. She thought for 30 seconds. Then she turned around. How fast can Dutch's wagon move if it's half-loaded? Samuel looked at her. Faster. But half-loaded means half the product, she said. We pull the heaviest preserved goods, keep the eggs and the produce and the bread lighter faster. We go early before the Ford floods. She looked at him. Can you drive it? In this weather. I'll come with you, she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that had moved past the open look and into something she didn't have a name for yet, something that was less about trust and more about the recognition of a person who, when things went wrong, moved toward the problem instead of away from it. Get your coat, he said. They were on the road in 40 minutes. She'd sent Dooley on horseback ahead to warn Dutch to pull his heaviest crates and have the lighter load ready. Dutch met them at his gate in the rain, already reorganized, already loading, and the four of them, Dutch, Dooley, Samuel, and Evelyn, worked the loading in the driving rain without wasting a word on complaining about the rain. Margaret met them at the road junction with the eggs packed and ready, because Margaret had heard the storm the same way Evelyn had, and had made the same calculation without needing to be told. I wondered if you'd cancel, Margaret said, handing up the packed crates. Did you think I would? Evelyn said. Margaret almost smiled. No, she said. They hit Bender's Ford with an hour to spare before it became impassable. She could see the water level in the creek rising while they crossed. Hear it under the wheels. Feel the wagon push and settle in the current. Samuel drove it with the steady hands of a man who had crossed that ford in every condition, and knew exactly how much the horses needed and how much they needed to be left alone. They made it. The camp cook met them at the supply tent with the particular relief of a man who had not expected them and was recalculating his opinion of their operation in real time. Didn't think you'd come through in this, he said. We said we would, Evelyn said. She was soaked through. She didn't mention it. You're short on the preserved goods, he said, looking at the load. We prioritize the fresh product and the bread, she said. The preserved goods will arrive Wednesday on the regular schedule. I'll credit you the difference on this delivery. He looked at her. He looked at the bread, which was still warm from Cal's oven because she'd packed it last. He looked at the eggs intact, every one. No credit necessary, he said. You came through in a storm. That's worth more than a few jars of preserves. He paused. My agent Blackwell's man didn't come last Wednesday, said weather. It wasn't raining Wednesday. I know, she said. He nodded slowly. Wednesday for the rest of the order, he said. And, he paused. There's a second crew coming in 6 weeks. Another survey team, longer project, larger camp. They'll need a supply arrangement. She looked at him. The rain was running down her face and she didn't wipe it away. Tell me what they need, she said. She had her notebook in her coat pocket wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it out and wrote in it standing in the rain outside the supply tent while the camp cook listed requirements, and Samuel stood beside her, holding the horses steady, and behind them, Dutch and Dooley were covering the wagon for the return trip. And somewhere behind the clouds, the sun was going down on a day that had nearly broken the delivery and hadn't. On the ride back, the rain eased. The road was bad but passable. Samuel drove and she sat beside him, and for a long time, neither of them said anything. The way you didn't say anything after something that had been hard and had come out right. Then Samuel said, "Second crew." "Double the contract volume," she said. "We don't have the capacity," he said. "Not yet," she said. He looked at the road. "How long?" "4 weeks if I bring in 2 more farms," she said. "There are 2 operations east of Margaret's I haven't approached yet. I've been waiting until we had the railroad contract secured well enough that I could offer them something real." "It's secured," he said. "It is," she said. He was quiet again. The horses moved through the dark, steady and sure. Then he said, "Ada Pryor's smokehouse she mentioned last week. She had capacity she wasn't using. If the second crew needs smoked meat on a regular schedule—" "I know," Evelyn said. "I was going to ask her Thursday." "I already mentioned it to her," Samuel said. "When I rode past her fence line Tuesday, she said to have you come by." She turned to look at him. He was watching the road. "You talked to Ada Pryor about supply capacity," she said. "I was riding past," he said. "It seemed worth mentioning." She looked at him for a moment longer. The man who had sat across a dinner table 8 weeks ago and told her his system needed to be respected and that she was there to manage the household was riding through rain in the dark to deliver produce on a schedule he'd helped build, talking to neighboring farmers about capacity on her behalf and calling it passing by. "Samuel," she said. "Don't make it a thing," he said. "I'm not making it a thing," she said. "I'm just—" She stopped. "Thank you." He drove. The horses walked. The rain tapped on the wagon cover. "Evelyn?" he said after a while. "The roses," he said. "The front beds." He paused. "I want to move them to the side yard near the fence by the water barrel. They'll still get light. They'll still be there." Another pause. "But the front ground, you said you'd need more ground for the second contract." She felt something move through her that had no practical name. "Are you sure?" she said quietly. "Eleanor would have said the same thing I did tonight when you asked if we could do the delivery," he said. "She would have said, 'Get your coat.'" He looked at the road. She was practical. I forgot that too. She didn't say anything. She wasn't sure there was anything to say that would be adequate. "We'll move them together," she said. "When the ground is dry." He nodded. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was not empty, that was in fact so full of things that had been said and built and decided in the past weeks that it needed no more words to carry its weight. The ranch came into view in the dark, the lamp she'd left burning in the kitchen window, making a small gold square against the night. She looked at it and thought about the woman who had arrived on a stagecoach 8 weeks ago with a travel trunk and sharp eyes, and a plan that hadn't been fully formed yet, and she thought about where the plan stood now. The milling contract, the lawyers, the bakers, the second survey crew, the 4 farms coordinating the wagon route, the documentation at the county office. And she thought it was remarkable how much could grow from a first row of radishes planted along a fence line in red dirt. Remarkable, and also not surprising at all, because the ground had been ready. It had just been waiting for someone who knew how to read it. The ground was dry enough to move the roses 4 days after the storm. She hadn't planned it to be an occasion. She'd simply looked at the front yard that morning, tested the soil with her boot, and said to Samuel across the breakfast table, "Today's the day if you're ready." He'd put down his coffee cup and said, "Give me an hour." And that was that. They worked side by side through the mid-morning, and it was harder than either of them had anticipated, not physically, though the root systems were deep and well established after 3 years of careful tending, but in the particular way that doing something final is always harder than you expect, even when you've decided you're ready. Samuel dug carefully. He didn't rush. She held the root balls while he repositioned the plants in the side yard near the water barrel, and she could feel in the weight of each plant the years Eleanor had put into them, and she held them like they were something worth holding. He patted the last plant into place and stood up and looked at it. He didn't say anything for a moment. She stood beside him and didn't fill the silence. Then he said, "She'd have liked you." Evelyn looked at him. "Eleanor," he said. He was still looking at the rose. She didn't have patience for performance, only for real things. He turned to look at Evelyn. "You're a real thing." She held his gaze. "So are you," she said. "When you let yourself be." He made that sound that wasn't a laugh and wasn't not a laugh, and he picked up the shovel, and they went to work on the front ground that was now for the first time since Eleanor had planted it open and ready and waiting to be productive. She had the first seeds in that new ground by afternoon. What she didn't know, while she was on her knees in the dirt of the former rose beds, was that 40 miles away in the territory office Jonas Aldridge was sitting across a desk from two members of the Joint County Territory Review Board, presenting Harlan Coates' operational records in a leather folder that had been organized with the kind of precision that told any experienced administrator exactly how serious the presenting party was. She didn't know because Aldridge had told her he would handle it, and she had believed him, and belief was a thing she had always been more comfortable acting on than questioning. What she found out that evening, when Aldridge rode out to the ranch himself instead of sending a message, was that the review board had dismissed Griggs's complaint. Not tabled it, not held it for further review, dismissed it with a notation in the record that the complaint lacked operational basis and appeared inconsistent with the documented performance history of the coat mill. Aldridge sat at the kitchen table and said it plainly without drama, which was the only way Aldridge said anything. "It's not permanent protection," he said. "Blackwell can file again with different grounds. But this is on the record now a dismissed complaint, a complete operational file, and a notation of possible retaliatory intent. The next complaint goes to a board that's already seen this one." He looked at her. "He'll have to work harder to make the next one stick." "Will there be a next one?" Samuel said. "Depends on whether he decides we're worth the effort," Evelyn said. Aldridge looked at her. "My assessment is that you're currently at the edge of what he considers manageable disruption. The milling contract, the bakers, the railroad supply, each of those individually he might absorb. Together," he paused. "Together you've built something that affects his pricing structure in ways that are visible to other operators in the territory. That's the threshold. Once other operations see that routing around him is possible, some of them will try. And that's what he can't afford," Evelyn said. "That's what he cannot afford," Aldridge confirmed. She nodded slowly. She looked at the table. Then she said, "What does he do when he's at that threshold?" Aldridge was quiet for a moment. "In my experience," he said, "men like Blackwell at that threshold either consolidate, pull back, protect core assets, let the periphery go, or they escalate. They make an example." "An example of what?" Samuel said. "Of whoever is leading the disruption," Aldridge said. He looked at Evelyn steadily. "I don't say this to frighten you. I say it so you're not surprised." "I'm not frightened," she said, "and I won't be surprised." She looked at him. "What form does escalation usually take?" "Legal challenges," he said. "Against your market operation zoning licensing operating permits you may not know you need. Or personal reputation history, anything that can be made to look disqualifying." She looked at him. "My history," she said, not a question. "You're a mail-order bride from Ohio," Aldridge said, not unkindly, directly. "In this territory, in this time that carries—" "I know what it carries," she said. "If he digs into your background, he'll find a woman who kept her father's household for 15 years, managed his accounts, and ran his farm stand in Franklin County for 8 years before she answered a correspondence column," she said. "He'll find a woman without scandal, without debt, and without anything worth using except the fact of how she arrived here, which is public knowledge and not my shame." She held Aldridge's gaze. "Let him dig." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup. "All right," he said. "Then we focus on licensing." "What do we need?" he told her. It was less than she feared, and more than she'd thought to prepare for a market operating permit from the county, a food handling registration for anything preserved or processed, and a transport coordination license if she was running a multi-farm delivery route, which she technically was. None of it was difficult. All of it was the kind of thing Blackwell could use against her if she didn't have it, and was useless to him once she did. "How fast?" she said. "3 weeks if we move Monday," Aldridge said. "Move Monday," she said. After Aldridge left, she and Samuel sat at the table for a while in the quiet that followed consequential conversations. Outside the side yard, rose beds were settling into their new ground. The front yard was turned earth and new seed. The kitchen smelled like the soup she'd put on before Aldridge arrived and forgotten about until now, which was still simmering and somehow fine. Samuel said, "He's going to come at you personally." "Probably," she said. "And you're not worried." "I didn't say that," she said. She looked at him. "I said I won't be surprised. There's a difference." He was quiet. Then, "I'll stand with you, whatever he does. I want you to know that clearly." She looked at him. This man who had stood in a feed store and corrected the Finley brothers, who had driven through a storm to deliver produce, who had dug up his dead wife's roses with careful hands and moved them to the side yard because the front ground was needed and Eleanor would have understood, and she thought about what it meant to be told clearly that someone would stand with you. Not offered, not implied, stated, clearly. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." He nodded once. Neither of them moved. The soup simmered. The lamp burned. And the particular quiet of two people who have said the real thing settled over the kitchen like something earned. The escalation came as Aldridge had predicted, on two fronts simultaneously, which told her it had been planned. You didn't coordinate a legal challenge and a reputational move on the same day by accident. The legal challenge arrived as a notice from the county office questioning the operating status of her market stand, a formal inquiry into whether she held the required permits for multi-farm coordinated sales on private land adjacent to a public road. It was technically legitimate. She'd known it was coming since Aldridge named it. She had her response ready before the notice was 3 hours old because she'd been preparing the permit application since Monday, and 2 of the 3 were already filed. The reputational move was subtler and in its way more revealing. It came through Mrs. Hartley at the dry goods store, which was the mechanism through which most information of a particular type moved through Redstone Crossing. Mrs. Hartley told 3 customers that morning with the particular precision of a woman who knows exactly how information travels and has calculated where she wants it to land, that a mail-order bride from Ohio running a market operation out of a ranch yard was, in her considered opinion, not a woman of established character, and that certain questions about her background and her real motives for the arrangement with Samuel Mercer deserved community consideration. Evelyn heard this by 10 o'clock from Margaret, who had heard it from Ada Pryor, who had been in the store buying thread when Mrs. Hartley said it. She put down what she was doing. She stood still for a moment. She felt the particular coldness of it, not embarrassment, because she didn't have anything to be embarrassed about, but the cold of being targeted in a way that was designed to be untraceable. Mrs. Hartley would never say Blackwell sent her. She might not even know he had. She might have arrived at it herself because women like Mrs. Hartley could be led to conclusions they believed were their own, and Blackwell was the kind of man who understood that mechanism precisely. She went to the dry goods store. She did not go in anger. She went with the particular calm of a woman who understood that visible anger was a weapon she would be handing to the other side, and she had not come this far by handing weapons to the other side. Mrs. Hartley was behind the counter. She saw Evelyn come in, and her posture went careful in the way of someone who knows exactly what is coming and has prepared a face for it. "Mrs. Mercer," she said. "Mrs. Hartley," Evelyn said. She walked to the counter. She placed her hands on it, not aggressively, just present, physical there. "I heard what you said this morning." Mrs. Hartley opened her mouth. "I'd like to respond to it directly," Evelyn said. Not through the same chain, but to you, right now. Mrs. Hartley closed her mouth. I came to Redstone Crossing because I answered a correspondence column and Samuel Mercer wrote back. Evelyn said. That is a fact. It is not a character judgment. Women have been building lives in this territory through correspondence arrangements since before either of us was born, and those women have been the backbone of every community they entered. She held Mrs. Hartley's gaze without heat. My character is visible in what I have done here in 12 weeks. It is in the accounts I have kept, the arrangements I have honored, the farmers I have supported, the permits I am filing, the storm I drove through to make a delivery I promised. She paused. I do not have anything to hide, and I have not done anything worth hiding. If you have a specific concern about my character, I am standing in front of you, and you may raise it directly. The store was quiet. There was one other customer at the back pretending to examine fabric. Mrs. Hartley's face had moved through 3 different expressions, none of which she'd been quick enough to control. She started. I am also aware, Evelyn said quieter now, that what you said this morning may not have originated with you. I hold no particular grudge if that's the case. But I would ask you to consider the source of any information that comes to you suggesting reasons to doubt my character, and to ask yourself whose interests are served by Redstone Crossing doubting me. She straightened. Good morning, Mrs. Hartley. She bought a spool of thread she didn't need and left. She was back at the market table within the hour, and she was steady, and she did not mention where she'd been to anyone who asked. Samuel found out through Dooley inevitably, because Dooley found out everything. That evening Samuel said, You went to Hartley directly. I did, she said. How did she take it? I don't know yet, she said. I'll know in a few days based on what stops circulating. He was quiet. Then, that took something. Not as much as you'd think, she said. Being direct is less exhausting than managing what people say about you from a distance. He looked at her with an expression she knew well by now, the one that meant he was filing something away, learning something about how she operated, and cross-referencing it with what he'd already learned. Blackwell sent her the information, he said. It wasn't a question. Almost certainly, she said. He's not finding anything useful in my background, so he's manufacturing the implication of something. It's the move of a man running low on legitimate pressure. Running low, Samuel said slowly. Does that mean what I think it means? It means he's close to the point where pursuing us costs him more than letting us operate, she said. But close isn't there, and a man who hasn't hit that point yet is still dangerous. The point arrived sooner than she expected, and from a direction she hadn't fully anticipated, which was the thing about the real turning points, they rarely announce themselves. It was Dutch Farner who brought her the news riding up to the gate on a Thursday morning with the purposeful speed of a man carrying something urgent. She met him at the gate, and he climbed down and said without preamble, Blackwell made an offer to the railroad company. She went still. His man was at the Territory Railroad office day before yesterday, Dutch said. Word got back through the survey crew. He offered to take over the full supply contract for both crews existing and incoming at a rate 10% below what we're currently charging. She absorbed that. 10% below our rate still covers his costs because of his volume, Dutch said. He can absorb the discount. We can't match it dollar for dollar without going under. She looked at him. When does the offer close? They said 2 weeks, Dutch said. The railroad office wants a decision by the end of the month. 2 weeks. She did the math automatically, not just on the pricing, but on everything the permits Aldridge was filing, the coat milling contract, the bakers, the second crew's supply requirements, the 2 eastern farms she hadn't yet approached. How much below his offer can we go without losing margin? She said. Maybe 5%, Dutch said. If we pull every efficiency we have, if Ada smokes the meat in-house instead of outsourcing any part, if Margaret pushes egg production, if we cut the coordination fee from the baker's flour supply. He shook his head. Maybe 5, not 10. We're not going to match his price, she said. Dutch looked at her sharply. Then we lose the contract. "We're not going to match his price," she said again. "Because matching his price is fighting his fight on his terms. We're going to offer something he can't." She looked at Dutch steadily. "What does the railroad company care about more than price?" Dutch was quiet. "Schedule," she said. "Reliability, not being shorted. Not having their camp cook standing in an empty supply tent because Blackwell's agent said weather when it wasn't raining." She looked at him. "We drove through an actual storm to make a delivery. The cook mentioned it to the crew lead. The crew lead mentioned it to the territory office because it was notable." She held Dutch's gaze. "We don't compete on price. We compete on the thing that a volume operation like Blackwell's structurally cannot offer: personal accountability." Dutch was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that was thinking, not doubting. "You want to go to the railroad office directly," he said. "I want to request a meeting with whoever makes the contract decision," she said, "before the 2 weeks are up. I want to present our record, every delivery, every date, the storm, all of it. And I want to make a case that reliable supply from a coordinated local network is worth a premium that Blackwell's discounted rate doesn't account for." "They may take the cheaper option anyway," Dutch said. "They may," she said. "But they haven't yet, and they don't have to decide yet. And I have 12 weeks of documented delivery history that Blackwell's offer cannot produce because he hasn't been supplying us. We have." Dutch picked up his hat, which he'd been holding in his hands since he climbed off his horse, and he turned it once, and then he put it back on his head. "When do you ride?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Samuel will come with me. I want you there too." "Me," he said. "You represent the supply side of the cooperative," she said. "I need the railroad office to see that this is not one woman with a vegetable stand. I need them to see that this is an organized operation with multiple farms, documented capacity, and people who show up in storms." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll be at your gate at first light." She was at the gate at first light. They all were Dutch and his good coat Samuel, with the delivery records she'd organized into a leather case that she'd bought specifically for this meeting because presentation was not vanity, it was communication. And she was not going to walk into a railroad territory office with papers loose in her hands. The meeting was with a man named Hargrove, a territory contracts administrator in his 40s, with the clipped efficiency of someone who processed a large number of requests, and had developed an economy of attention that made him seem colder than she suspected he was. He looked at the leather case when she set it on his desk. He looked at the three of them, Evelyn, Samuel, Dutch. He looked at Evelyn longest, with the particular recalibration that happened when a woman walked into a room that hadn't expected one. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "you're here about the supply contract." "I'm here to present our delivery record before you make a decision," she said. "I'd like 15 minutes. He glanced at the case. Something in his expression shifted, not quite interest, but the precursor to it. 10, he said. She took 8. She laid it out plainly, without sentiment, and without embellishment. 12 weeks of delivery records, each one dated and initialed by the camp cook. The storm delivery with the cook's written acknowledgement. The expansion to the second crew's requirements. The local farm network names, capacities, the coat milling contract. The permits Aldridge had filed. The pricing structure, and where it sat relative to Blackwell's offer. She did not say anything negative about Blackwell. She didn't need to. The cook's note about the agent who cited weather when it wasn't raining was in the file. She let Hargrove find it himself. He found it. She saw his eyes stop on it. She said nothing. When she finished, he looked at the records for a moment longer than the 10 minutes they'd agreed on. Then he said, "The coordinated network you're describing, how many farms?" "Currently 6, she said. "I have commitments from 2 more that will be formal within the month. And the milling arrangement if your volume doubles for the second crew." "Coates' contract covers the expanded volume," she said. "I had that built into the agreement from the beginning." Hargrove looked at her. "You had the second crew's requirements built into a milling contract you signed before the second crew was announced." "I planned for growth," she said simply. He looked at the file again. He closed it. He set his hands on it. I can't give you an answer today, he said. I'm not asking for one today, she said. I'm asking you to have the complete picture before you decide. He nodded. You'll hear from us by end of week. She stood and Samuel and Dutch stood with her, and she shook Hargrove's hand and walked out of that office with her back straight and her pace even, and she did not let herself think about the outcome until they were outside and the door was closed behind them. Dutch exhaled audibly. Well, he said. Samuel said nothing. He looked at her. We wait, she said. They heard on Friday. Hargrove sent a letter by courier, which arrived at the ranch in the early afternoon, and Samuel brought it to her at the market table without opening it, which was a thing she noted that he had not opened it, that he had brought it to her because it was hers to open. She opened it. She read it once. Then she read it again. The railroad company was maintaining their supply contract with the Mercer Cooperative, the name Hargrove had used, which was not a name she'd given them, but which was, she realized, exactly right for both the existing crew and the incoming second crew at the negotiated rate, plus a 5% reliability premium, which was a thing she had not asked for and had not expected, a reliability premium. She looked at the letter for a moment longer. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. Well, Samuel said. We kept the contract, she said. And they added a reliability premium. Dutch made a sound she had never heard from him before, a short, sharp sound of pure disbelief that was also underneath it pure relief. He turned away for a moment, which was Dutch's version of needing a second to himself. Samuel looked at her. His face was doing the open thing fully without reservation. A premium, he said. For showing up in a storm, she said. He took his hat off. He ran his hand through his hair. He put the hat back on. He said, I'll be... and stopped because there wasn't a word for it that fit the size of it. She understood exactly. Blackwell's response came the following Monday, and it was not what she'd expected, which meant she had finally moved past the point where she could fully predict him, which was both a sign of progress and a new kind of exposure. He came himself. No representative, no buckboard companion. He rode alone to the gate on a horse that was better than anything she'd seen him drive before, and he dismounted and walked to the market table, and she stood behind it and waited. He looked different, not diminished. Blackwell was not a man who diminished easily, but adjusted. The precise courtesy was still there, but it had changed in quality. It was the courtesy of a man making a calculation, not performing a dominance. Mrs. Mercer, he said. Mr. Blackwell. He looked at the table, at the market sign, at the road behind him. Then he looked at her. The railroad premium, he said. That was not a small thing. No, she said. It wasn't. You've built something that I underestimated, he said. It was not an apology. It was an accurate assessment delivered with the flat honesty of a man who could face facts when the facts had become unavoidable. I thought you were a disruption I could contain. You're not. She waited. I want to discuss a boundary arrangement, he said. Not absorption, not your network into my supply chain. A boundary, your territory, my territory defined clearly. You don't undercut my operations east of the county line. I don't interfere with your West County contracts. We operate separately. She looked at him. And Coates Mill. Coat Mills for your network, he said. I don't move on his license again. In writing, she said. He was quiet for a moment. In writing, he said. Aldridge drafts it, she said. Another brief quiet. Fine. She looked at him steadily. The wagon drivers you pulled, she said. The 3 who were buying here before you canceled their contracts. What about them? Their contracts are restored, she said, as a condition of the boundary agreement. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not anger, which would have been expected. Something closer to recognition. The look of a man seeing for the first time the full scope of what he was dealing with and understanding that it was not going to get smaller. You're negotiating from a produce stand, he said. Yes, she said pleasantly. He was quiet for another moment. Then, the driver's contracts are restored. He said it like a man who had decided to stop fighting a tide. Not broken Blackwell would never be broken, but redirected. Then I'll have Aldridge draw up the boundary agreement, she said. We can sign by the end of the week. He nodded. He turned to go. Then he stopped. One question, he said. He didn't turn back around, which she noted a man asking a question he didn't want to be seen asking. How did you know I'd come to the table? She thought about it honestly. I didn't know, she said. I knew that if I built something real enough, you'd have to make a choice between fighting it and accommodating it. I didn't know which you'd choose. A pause. What would you have done if I'd kept fighting? Kept building, she said. He didn't say anything more. He mounted his horse and rode away down the road, and she watched him until he was gone. And then she looked at the table, the neat bundles, the eggs in their packing, the baked goods from Ruth Pasley's kitchen, the herbs from Ada's farm, the labels she'd lettered herself, and she felt something settle in her that had not been fully still since she'd climbed down from the stagecoach with travel dust on her coat and pressed her fingers into the wrong soil of Samuel Mercer's decorative front yard. The boundary agreement was signed Friday. Aldridge drafted it. Blackwell's attorney reviewed it. Both men signed it in the presence of a county witness, and Aldridge filed a copy with the county records office before the ink was dry because Aldridge understood that the value of a document lived in its registration. She held her copy of the signed agreement at the kitchen table that evening, and Samuel sat across from her, and neither of them felt the need to celebrate in a large way, because the people who had built what they'd built didn't tend to celebrate large. They tended to look at what came next. The 2 eastern farms, Samuel said. I'm riding out Monday, she said. I know the Hendersons better than you do, he said. Let me come. I was going to ask you to, she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. Then he said, the second crew arrives in 3 weeks. We're ready, she said. Margaret's pushed the egg production. Ada has the smokehouse running full. Dutch's brother is delivering the hardware supply next week. Coat? Already milling at capacity, she said. He hired 2 additional hands last week. She paused. He told me it was the first time in 4 years he'd hired someone instead of letting someone go. Samuel was quiet. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. You know what you've done, he said. It wasn't a question. I know what we've done, she said. He looked at her. Don't do that, he said quietly. Don't give it away. You built this. I helped. Margaret helped. Dutch and Ada and Coat helped. But you saw it first. You stood at a fence line in red dirt and saw a market where there was a rose bed, and you were right, and that matters. She looked at him. She felt the warmth of it. Not the soft, tentative warmth of the early weeks, but something steady and established, the warmth of a fire that had been burning long enough to know it wasn't going out. All right, she said. I built it. You built it, he said. Outside the road was quiet. The market stand was folded for the evening. In the side yard, Eleanor's roses were setting into their new ground, still blooming, still cared for, moved but not lost, accommodated into a larger design instead of standing in the way of one. In the front yard, the rows she'd planted ran deep and productive and visible from the road in both directions. The kind of thing that people slowed to look at without knowing exactly why. Because it had the quality of something that had been thought through, something that had been meant. And 6 weeks later, when the second railroad crew arrived, and the Mercer Cooperative's delivery ran to schedule without a single shortage, and the camp cook shook her hand and said he'd never had a supply arrangement. He trusted this completely, and when Dutch's brother secured 2 additional hardware contracts through the network she'd built, and when Ruth Paisley told her quietly over coffee that she'd hired a second baker because her volume had doubled, she stood at the market table at the end of that day and looked down the road in both directions and thought about the woman who had arrived here with nothing but a travel trunk and sharp eyes, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had been underestimated so many times that she'd learned to use it like a tool. She had not come to Redstone Crossing to save a ranch. She had not come to fight a supply monopolist, or build a cooperative network, or protect a miller's license, or negotiate a boundary agreement with the most powerful commercial operator in the territory. She had come because a man wrote her a letter, and she wrote back, and the ground looked promising from the window of a stagecoach, And she had always known that promising ground was not the same as finished ground. That between what land could be and what it was, sat the distance that only work covered, only patience crossed, only the willingness to kneel in the dirt and plant something before you knew for certain it would grow. She had planted. It had grown. Not just the radishes and the beans and the tomatoes and the herbs, but the network, the trust, the arrangement that was now 6 farms coordinated and 2 bakers supplied and 1 miller running at full capacity, and a boundary agreement that had given the whole West County room to breathe. Samuel came to stand beside her at the close of that day, the way he had started doing at the end of most days, and they stood together on the road and looked at what the front yard had become the most productive piece of ground in Redstone Crossing, visible to everyone who passed, impossible to ignore. "We need to talk about the eastern expansion," he said. "I know," she said, "and the winter supply plan. I know. And Aldridge thinks there may be a case for a formal cooperative charter under territory law." "Samuel," she said. He stopped. "Tomorrow," she said. "All of it tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Fair enough." She looked at the ground. Her ground now, their ground that had been decorative and was now alive with purpose. And she thought about what it meant to build something from a standing start, in a place that hadn't expected you, that had watched you climb down from a stagecoach and made its judgments before your boots hit the dirt. What it meant was this: you did the work. You did it in the rain and in the dirt and in the face of men with precise courtesy and thin smiles. You did it early in the morning before anyone else was awake, and late at night by lamplight, when the numbers needed to be right. You did it when the wagon drivers were pulled, and the flour prices went up, and the complaint was filed, and the threat was delivered. You did it through all of it without stopping, without making it smaller than it was, without accepting someone else's definition of what you were or what you were capable of. And then one day you looked up, and the ground was full, and the road was busy, and the people who had whispered behind gloved hands in front of the dry goods store had stopped whispering, because there was nothing left to whisper about. And the man who had stood on his porch with the careful stillness of concealed disappointment was standing beside you at the end of the day, like a man who had found in the last place he expected exactly what he needed. She had not saved a ranch. She had built an economy. She had not managed a household. She had restructured the terms under which her entire community survived. And the mail-order bride from Ohio, who had pressed her fingers into the wrong soil on the day she arrived, who had looked at roses where a market should have been, and known with the certainty of someone who had been reading ground her whole life, that the land was trying to tell a different story. That woman was done being what Redstone Crossing had expected. She was exactly, entirely, and permanently what she had always been: the woman who saw what the land was worth before anyone else thought to look.